The message popped up just as I was about to turn off the engine. Urgent, O negative needed. Active bleeding. Naval Medical Center, Norfolk. Please share. I stared at the screen, my fingers still wrapped around the steering wheel, the tick of the cooling engine echoing in the quiet parking lot. I almost kept scrolling. I had already given 16 hours to the uniform that day, but something about the phrasing active bleeding lodged in my chest like a splinter. 10 minutes later, I was back on the highway driving into the night to give blood to someone I'd never met. 2 weeks later, I would walk into my commander's office and find a man wearing 4 stars waiting for me. The night had started like any other long one at Joint Expeditionary Logistics Support Unit, a stretch of gray hangars and sodium lights just outside Norfolk. My name is Major Laura Bennett, United States Army Medical Logistics Corps. 20 years in uniform teaches you to measure your day in shipments, checklists, and quiet decisions no one else ever sees. That afternoon, we'd processed 3 emergency airlift pallets bound for a hurricane staging area in Georgia. The wind off the coast had been sharp, carrying the smell of diesel and salt, and by the time the last crate rolled onto the transport, my shoulders felt like sandbags. I remember sitting in my pickup in the far corner of the lot, the radio murmuring some late-night talk show, the kind that fills silence without asking for attention. My boots were still dusty from the loading bay, and my right hand ached from signing manifests. I had already texted my sister that I'd call her the next day. I had already decided dinner would be whatever was left in the fridge. My mind had narrowed to one simple goal: go home, shower, sleep. Then my phone buzzed. The post came from a local veterans group I followed mostly out of habit. The photo attached showed nothing dramatic, just a hospital hallway, and a caption typed in all caps. The words were clinical, almost blunt. O negative. Trauma case. Family requesting donors. Time critical. I read it once, then again. O negative, universal donor, the rare card in my wallet that I'd almost forgotten about. I leaned back in the seat. You're exhausted, I muttered to no one. They'll find someone else. The thought felt reasonable, even responsible. My shift had technically ended and I had another early briefing. The drive to Naval Medical Center, Norfolk would take 20 minutes in light traffic longer if the bridge slowed. There were probably dozens of donors already heading there. But my thumb hovered over the screen. The post had only been up 6 minutes, 2 shares, 1 comment. Please hurry. The parking lot was empty except for a maintenance truck idling near the far fence. The wind rattled a loose sign somewhere behind me. I thought about the times I'd coordinated emergency supplies for strangers, bandages, IV fluids, field kits, never knowing who they were or whether they made it. This felt different. This was immediate, personal, measured in minutes instead of manifests. I exhaled slowly. All right, I said almost under my breath. Let's go. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble. I pulled out of the lot, the base gate lights fading in the rearview mirror. The road toward Norfolk stretched dark and quiet, lined with low marshland, and the occasional flicker of porch lights in the distance. My fatigue didn't disappear, but it settled into the background, replaced by a steady, purposeful calm. The kind that comes when you've made a decision, and the rest is just motion. Traffic was light. A tanker truck passed in the opposite lane, headlights slicing through the dark. My phone buzzed again, another share, another comment. Family waiting. I tightened my grip on the wheel. I didn't know who they were. A sailor, a civilian, a kid. The uncertainty made the silence in the cab feel heavier. By the time I crossed the Elizabeth River, the hospital's lights were already visible against the night sky. Naval Medical Center, Norfolk always looked different after midnight, quieter, more solemn. The emergency entrance glowed white ambulances parked like sentries along the curb. I pulled into visitor parking and shut off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there listening to the ticking metal and distant hum of generators. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. A volunteer at the desk looked up, surprised. Are you here for the donor call? Yes, ma'am, I said. Oh, negative. She nodded quickly, relief flickering across her face. They'll be grateful. Right this way. The donor room was half lit, a handful of chairs arranged in neat rows. A nurse handed me forms, her voice efficient but kind. We've had a few people come in. You're one of the first with the right type. I signed where she pointed, rolled up my sleeve, and settled into the chair. The vinyl was cool against my arm. As the needle slid in, I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny perforations. The machine hummed softly beside me. I focused on my breathing, steady and even. I'd donated before, but tonight felt heavier, more immediate. Somewhere beyond those walls, someone was fighting to stay alive. My part in it was small, measured in ounces, but it was something. When the bag filled, the nurse smiled. "You're all set, Major. Take it easy for a bit." I sat up, slowly flexing my fingers. That's when I noticed him. He was seated in the chair next to mine, though I hadn't seen him arrive. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. Gray hair, posture straight, despite the fatigue in his eyes. He wore a simple jacket and slacks, nothing that marked him as military. But there was something about the way he held himself calm, composed, that made me look twice. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I heard them mention your blood type." I shrugged, just saw the post. He studied me for a moment as if committing something to memory. Not everyone does. I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. The room was quiet except for the low hum of equipment. After a pause, he added, "May, I ask your name?" "Laura Bennett," I replied. "Major, Army." He nodded slowly. "I appreciate what you did tonight, Major Bennett. You may have done more than you realize." I offered a small smile, just glad I could help. He didn't introduce himself. He simply sat back, eyes distant, as if listening for news from somewhere deeper in the hospital. After a moment, I stood, thanked the nurse, and headed for the door. As I left, I glanced back. He raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement. Outside, the night air felt cooler. I climbed into my truck, my arm slightly sore, and started the engine. The hospital lights faded behind me as I drove toward home. I didn't know who the patient was. I didn't know if the donation would make a difference. But the decision felt right, simple, clean, complete. I had no idea that the man in that chair would be waiting for me again in 2 weeks, wearing 4 silver stars and holding my future in his hands. The sugar cookies they handed me tasted like cardboard, but I ate one anyway, more out of habit than hunger. The donor lounge was quiet. The fluorescent lights softened for the late hour, and the hum of the hospital seemed to settle into something almost peaceful. My arm throbbed faintly where the bandage pressed against the crook of my elbow. I leaned back in the chair, letting the dizziness pass the way the nurse had instructed, counting slow breaths. Across from me, the man who had thanked me earlier sat with his hands folded, gaze fixed on the floor as if measuring time in silence. It's strange how you notice small things when you're tired. The crease in his jacket was sharp despite the long night. His shoes were polished, not flashy, just well cared for. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't pace. He waited with the stillness of someone used to letting events unfold without interference. I'd seen that posture before, officers waiting outside surgical wards, commanders listening for word after an operation, parents who understood panic wouldn't speed anything up. The nurse returned with a clipboard. "We're stabilizing him now," she told the man gently. "The transfusion is helping." His shoulders lowered just a fraction, the only visible sign of relief. "Thank you," he said, voice calm but heavy with meaning. I looked down at the empty wrapper in my hands. So it was a him. A son, maybe. A grandson. I didn't ask. It felt intrusive. The hospital had its own rhythm, and we were just 2 people sharing a quiet corner inside it. After a few minutes, he spoke again. "You drove in from base." "Yes, sir," I said automatically, then caught myself. "He wasn't in uniform. Sorry, habit." He gave a faint smile. "No apology needed. Old habits usually mean experience." "Army Medical Logistics," I said, "stationed nearby." "That explains the decisiveness," he replied. "You didn't hesitate long." I shrugged, long enough to almost go home. He nodded as if that mattered. Most people would have. The nurse passed again, adjusting a machine. Somewhere down the hall a phone rang and stopped abruptly. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. The man leaned back, studying the ceiling. "My daughter posted that message," he said after a moment. "She didn't think anyone would see it in time." I turned toward him. I'm glad I did. "So am I." His voice softened. "Family doesn't prepare you for moments like this. You think you're ready. Then suddenly you're not." I understood that. The uniform teaches you to handle emergencies, but it doesn't shield you from the human side of them. "He'll be okay," I said, not because I knew, but because it felt necessary. He looked at me, eyes steady. "He already is because people like you showed up." The nurse approached again. "You can see him briefly, sir. Just for a minute." The man stood smoothing his jacket. Before he followed her, he turned back to me. "I didn't catch your full name earlier." "Laura Bennett." He repeated it quietly as if filing it away. "Thank you, Major Bennett." "You're welcome." He hesitated, then added, "You may never know what tonight means to my family, but I will." The words were simple, delivered without theatrics. Then he followed the nurse down the hall. I sat there a moment longer, the silence settling again. The dizziness had faded, replaced by a calm fatigue. After another cookie and a cup of water, I gathered my things and left the donor room. The hallway outside was brighter, nurses moving with practiced efficiency. Somewhere a monitor beeped steadily. I passed the waiting area and caught a glimpse of the man standing beside a hospital bed inside a partially open door. His posture had softened, one hand resting gently on the blanket. I didn't linger. The moment belonged to him, not me. Outside, the air carried the damp chill of the coast. The parking lot lights reflected off the pavement, turning everything silver. I slid into my truck and rested my head briefly against the seat. My body felt heavier now, the adrenaline gone. The engine started and I eased onto the road, the hospital shrinking in the mirror. The drive home blurred into a quiet ribbon of asphalt. A cargo ship's lights flickered in the distance across the water. The radio murmured low. My arm ached slightly, a reminder of the small exchange that had taken place, blood for time, time for hope. I didn't think about recognition or consequence. I assumed the night would fade into memory like so many other small decisions that never surface again. At a red light near the base entrance, my phone buzzed again. Another update from the same veterans page, donor found. "Thank you all. Patient stable." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That was enough, more than enough. I reached my quarters just after midnight. The hallway was quiet, the hum of air conditioning the only sound. I kicked off my boots, set my keys on the table, and ran the shower hot. The water stung my shoulders, washing away the smell of diesel and antiseptic. As steam filled the bathroom, the events of the night replayed in fragments. The post, the drive, the man's calm voice. "You may have done more than you realize." It sounded dramatic in hindsight, but he hadn't said it that way. Just a quiet statement, like someone noting the weather. I shook my head, dismissing it. People say things in hospitals they don't mean to sound profound. Stress bends words. I fell asleep almost instantly, the exhaustion finally catching up. Morning came too soon, sunlight slicing through the blinds. My alarm buzzed at 0600. My arm felt stiff but manageable. I dressed in uniform, pinned my ribbons, and headed back to base. The day unfolded like any other briefings, inventory reports, supply coordination. No one mentioned the previous night. No medals, no emails, no follow-up calls. Exactly as I expected. The Army runs on continuity, not sentiment. I moved through tasks methodically, the memory of the hospital settling quietly in the background. At lunch, Lieutenant Harris glanced at the bandage on my arm. "You donate." "Yes." "Must have been urgent. They don't usually call you in that late." "Just saw a post," I said. He nodded, already returning to his tray. The conversation ended there. No fanfare, no curiosity. It suited me fine. That afternoon, as I finalized a shipment manifest, I caught myself wondering about the man. Not his identity, just whether his grandson or son was sitting up, whether the transfusion had held. I hoped so. Then I pushed the thought aside. My role had ended in that chair. 2 days later, the bandage came off. The mark faded. The routine resumed fully. If anyone had told me then that the quiet conversation in that donor room would echo through the chain of command, I would have laughed. Life rarely circles back that neatly. But 2 weeks later, when the message came through, Major Bennett report to the commander's office at 0900, I would remember his steady eyes, his measured voice, and the way he'd repeated my name as if it mattered. At the time, I assumed it was just another briefing, another routine correction, another day in uniform. I had no idea that the man who only asked my name would be sitting behind that door waiting for me with 4 silver stars on his shoulders. The first sign that something had shifted came 3 days after the donation, and it arrived not with drama, but with a calendar notification. Mandatory Readiness Review 0730. I remember staring at the screen, coffee cooling in my hand, trying to reconstruct my schedule. The night I'd driven to the hospital, I'd logged out late, slept barely 4 hours, and reported in just before 0800. No one had said anything at the time. The briefing had already started, and I'd slipped quietly into the back, taken notes, and continued my day. It seemed minor routine friction in a busy unit. But the notification wasn't routine. When I stepped into the conference room, the air felt unusually formal. My battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Dwyer, sat at the head of the table, his posture, straight expression, unreadable. A few other officers were present, laptops open, the soft clatter of keys filling the silence. I took a seat, sensing immediately that this wasn't about supply metrics. Dwyer cleared his throat. "Major Bennett, before we begin, I'd like you to stay after. Brief discussion." "Yes, sir." The meeting itself passed in a blur of logistics charts and readiness numbers. My mind stayed anchored to the quiet tension in his voice. When the others filed out, he gestured for me to remain. The door closed softly behind the last officer. He folded his hands. "Major, I've reviewed your time logs from last Thursday night." "Yes, sir." "You departed base at 21:30. No official tasking. You returned at 0:15, correct?" "Yes, sir. He held up a hand. "I also noted you arrived late to the morning readiness briefing. 10 minutes." "I did, sir." "And you did not request schedule adjustment?" "No, sir." He leaned back, eyes steady. "Where were you?" I hesitated only briefly. "Naval Medical Center, Norfolk, sir. There was an urgent donor request. I have O negative." He studied me for a moment. "You left base to donate blood?" "Yes, sir." "On your own initiative?" "Yes, sir." The silence that followed felt heavier than I expected. I'd imagined mild acknowledgement, perhaps even approval. Instead, he exhaled slowly. "Major Bennett. I appreciate initiative, but we operate within structure. You were off shift but still on call. If an overnight logistics issue had arisen, you would have been unavailable." "I kept my phone on, sir." "That's not the point." His tone wasn't harsh, just firm. "Decisions like that require coordination. You made a personal call that affected operational readiness." I nodded. "Understood, sir." He watched me carefully, as if measuring my reaction. "I'm not issuing formal discipline, but I am documenting the deviation. You'll temporarily transfer to administrative support while we reassess coverage." The words landed quietly, but they landed hard. Administrative support meant desk duty, data review, inventory tracking, internal coordination. No field runs, no convoy oversight, no operational planning. It wasn't punishment in name, but it felt like one. "Yes, sir," I said. He slid a paper across the desk. "Effective immediately. This is temporary. Maintain professionalism." I signed. My hand didn't shake, but I felt a slow tightening in my chest. Not anger, more a dull surprise. I hadn't expected praise, but I hadn't expected this either. I stood, saluted, and left the room. Outside, the corridor buzzed with normal activity boots on tile radios, crackling, someone laughing near the stairwell. The ordinariness of it all made the moment feel oddly isolated, as if the decision existed in a bubble only I could see. Lieutenant Harris caught up with me. "Everything good." "Just reassignment," I said evenly. "Desk work." "For now." He frowned slightly. "You're one of the best we've got on convoy planning." "Apparently I needed a break," I replied, forcing a small smile. Word travels quietly in a unit. By afternoon, a few sideways glances confirmed it. Nothing overt, just subtle shifts. Conversations pausing when I entered. A junior officer whispering to another. It wasn't hostility, more curiosity, maybe skepticism. At my new desk, rows of spreadsheets replaced the open loading bays I was used to. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space. My supervisor, Chief Warrant Officer Alvarez, greeted me politely. "Temporary, huh? Happens to all of us." "Yes, ma'am." She handed me a stack of reports. Inventory reconciliation. "Start with these. You're thorough, so it shouldn't take long." I nodded and sat down. The keyboard felt foreign under my hands. Outside the window, I could see the tarmac where cargo trucks lined up, engines idling. A week earlier, I'd been coordinating those runs. Now, I watched from a distance. Mid-afternoon, Captain Miller leaned against my cubicle wall. He was friendly enough, but his tone carried a faint edge. "Heard you went rogue for a midnight donation." "I saw a post," I said, "that's all." He smirked lightly. "Saving the world on your own time, huh?" "Just helping someone." "Yeah, well, Command doesn't love surprises." He tapped the desk. "Careful, compassion's not always in the SOP." I met his gaze calmly. Neither is ignoring someone bleeding out. He paused, then shrugged. "Fair point, still structure matters." He walked away, leaving the faint smell of coffee behind. I returned to the spreadsheet, the numbers blurring slightly before refocusing. The exchange didn't anger me. It simply clarified the line I'd crossed between personal judgment and institutional expectation. That evening, as I left the building, the sky over Norfolk glowed orange with sunset. The wind off the water felt cooler, sharper. I walked past the loading bay, the clatter of chains and engines echoing in the distance. For a moment I wondered if I'd misjudged, if the late-night drive had been impulsive. Then I remembered the hospital hallway, the man's steady voice, the update on my phone, patient stable. The doubt eased. At home, I sat at the kitchen table, arm resting on the wood. The faint bruise from the donation had turned yellow at the edges, a small mark already fading. I traced it absently. If I had the choice again, I murmured I'd still go. The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed, tires humming on asphalt. I didn't expect recognition. I didn't need it. The uniform teaches you that some decisions live only inside you unseen. Still, as I turned off the light and headed to bed, I felt the subtle weight of the reassignment. Not regret, just the cost of choosing instinct over procedure. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't unfair exactly. It was simply how systems protect themselves. 2 weeks would pass in that quiet space, paperwork, routine, subdued conversations, before the door to my commander's office opened again. And when it did, the man who had only asked my name would be waiting inside wearing 4 stars that would change the meaning of everything. Desk duty has a different kind of silence. Out on the tarmac, noise is constant engines, forklifts, radios, shouted coordinates carried by wind. In administrative support, the quiet is artificial, shaped by fluorescent lights and the low hum of computers. It's the kind of silence that amplifies thought. Every keystroke sounds deliberate. Every pause feels longer than it should. By the end of the first week, I'd memorized the rhythm of the office. Alvarez arrived at 700 sharp, coffee in hand, already scanning reports. 2 specialists rotated inventory checks, their conversations clipped and efficient. A printer near the back wall jammed twice a day like clockwork. The air always smelled faintly of toner and stale air conditioning. It wasn't unpleasant, just contained. I worked steadily, reconciling supply logs, cross-checking manifests, flagging discrepancies. It wasn't difficult. In some ways, it was almost restful. But every time I glanced out the narrow window and saw the convoy vehicles lined up, something inside me tightened. I missed the unpredictability, the movement, the feeling that decisions mattered in real time. On the 4th day, Chief Morales stopped by my desk. He'd been with the unit longer than most, a mechanic with hands permanently stained by oil and decades of service. "Heard they parked you in here," he said quietly. "Temporary," I replied. He nodded, studying the reports spread across my desk. "You always were too good for paperwork." "I don't mind it." "Maybe. But you don't belong here." He leaned slightly closer. "They say you left base to donate blood." "Yes." He gave a faint, approving grunt. "My wife needed O-negative once. Years ago. A stranger showed up, never learned his name." He paused. "Sometimes the quiet things matter more than the loud ones." I met his gaze. "That's how I see it." Morales nodded and walked off, leaving the faint smell of machine oil behind. His words lingered longer than I expected. They didn't erase the reassignment, but they softened its edges. Not everyone shared his perspective. Captain Miller continued his subtle commentary, never hostile, just lightly dismissive. "You're getting real good at spreadsheets," he remarked one afternoon. "Maybe they'll keep you in admin permanently." Maybe I said, not looking up. He chuckled. "Don't take it personally. Command likes predictability." I finished entering a column before responding. "So do I, but not at the cost of someone's life." He shrugged. "Depends whose responsibility that life is." That night it felt like mine, I said quietly. He didn't answer, just nodded and moved on. The exchange wasn't heated, but it highlighted the divide between procedural clarity and personal judgment. Neither side was entirely wrong, but only one side had seen the hospital hallway at midnight. The second week settled into a steady routine. I arrived early, left late, and avoided unnecessary conversation. The reassignment had a curious effect. It sharpened my focus. If I was going to be here, I would do the work thoroughly. By Wednesday, I'd identified several inventory discrepancies that had gone unnoticed for months. Alvarez thanked me briefly, her tone warm but professional. "You've improved our accuracy already," she said. "That's not nothing." I appreciated that. Recognition, even small, grounded the day. Still, the absence of fieldwork felt like a quiet exile. Evenings were the hardest. After work, I'd sometimes walk along the perimeter road near the water. Norfolk's coastline carried a steady wind, the smell of salt mixing with diesel from passing ships. I'd watch cargo planes taxi in the distance, their lights blinking against the dusk. The scene reminded me of the pace I'd left behind, constant motion, purposeful noise. One night, about 10 days after the donation, my phone buzzed with a notification from the same veterans group. A short update: patient discharged. Recovering well. Family grateful for donors. No names, no details, just closure. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Relief spread slowly, quiet and steady. Whoever he was, he'd made it. The decision that night had helped. That was enough. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and watched the water darken. The wind tugged at my jacket, cool against my face. I thought about the man in the donor room, his calm demeanor, the way he'd repeated my name. I wondered if he'd ever know who I was beyond that moment. Probably not. People move on. Emergencies fade. That's the nature of things. Back in the office the next morning, the routine resumed. Reports, calls, inventory. The reassignment began to feel less temporary, more like a quiet new normal. I accepted it without bitterness. The Army has a way of reshaping expectations. You adapt. Late Friday afternoon, as I finalized a logistics summary, Alvarez stepped into my cubicle. "Major Bennett, you'll want to clear your schedule Monday morning." "Ma'am?" "Command requested you at 0900, Commander's office." I blinked. "Any context?" She shook her head. "Just marked priority." "Understood." She gave me a curious look, as if trying to read something in my expression, then left. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking at the end of a sentence. My first thought was routine review. Maybe they were reconsidering my assignment. My second thought was less comfortable, another reprimand, perhaps a formal one. The weekend passed quietly. I kept busy: laundry, groceries, a phone call with my sister. But the appointment lingered in the background like distant thunder. By Sunday night, I'd convinced myself it would be procedural, nothing more. Monday morning arrived crisp and bright. I pressed my uniform carefully, aligning ribbons, smoothing the collar. The act felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. As I walked across the courtyard toward headquarters, the sunlight reflected off the pavement, sharp and clean. Sailors moved briskly, conversations blending into a steady murmur. Everything looked ordinary. Inside the corridor outside the commander's office was quieter than usual. The aide at the desk glanced up. "Major Bennett, they're expecting you." "Yes." I adjusted my jacket, took a breath, and stepped toward the door. My mind ran through possibilities: evaluation, reassignment, maybe reinstatement. I didn't expect anything dramatic, just another conversation inside the machinery of command. The aide opened the door. "Go ahead, ma'am." I stepped inside and froze. Because seated across from my commander was a man I recognized immediately, even before my eyes registered the uniform. The same calm posture, the same steady gaze, the same quiet presence from the donor room. Only now silver stars gleamed on his shoulders, 4 of them. The silence in the room shifted, heavy and electric. My heart missed a beat as recognition crashed through me. The man who had only asked my name 2 weeks earlier looked up and met my eyes, a faint, knowing expression touching his face. And in that moment I realized the quiet decision I'd made in a hospital chair was about to echo far beyond anything I had imagined. For a heartbeat, the room felt smaller, as if the walls had shifted inward without sound. My mind struggled to reconcile the 2 images: the quiet man in the donor chair and the officer seated before me now. The same gray hair, the same calm expression, but everything else had changed. The uniform was immaculate, deep blue trimmed with gold. On each shoulder rested 4 silver stars catching the morning light from the window. Authority radiated from him, not in posture or volume, but in the stillness he carried, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. "Major Bennett," my commander said, breaking the silence, "please come in." I stepped forward, automatically, training taking over. My hand rose in a salute. "Sir." The 4-star officer returned it with crisp precision. "At ease, Major." His voice was exactly as I remembered, measured, calm, familiar. Commander Dwyer cleared his throat. "Major, this is General Thomas Warren, Deputy Commanding General, U.S. Army Medical Command." Recognition rippled through me more fully now. Not just a senior officer, a strategic-level commander, the kind whose decisions shaped entire regions, not individual units. My pulse quickened, though I kept my posture steady. "Good morning, Major Bennett," General Warren said. His eyes held that same faint warmth from the donor room. "I believe we've met." "Yes, sir," I replied quietly. Dwyer looked between us, confusion flickering across his face. "You've met?" General Warren folded his hands. 2 weeks ago, Naval Medical Center, Norfolk, Donor Lounge. The room fell silent again. Dwyer straightened slightly. "I wasn't aware." "I imagine not," the general said. His tone remained calm, but there was weight behind it. He gestured toward the chair opposite the desk. "Please, Major, have a seat." I sat careful to keep my movements composed. The hum of the air conditioning filled the brief pause. Dwyer glanced at a folder on his desk, then back at the general as if recalculating the entire conversation. General Warren spoke first. "Major Bennett, do you recall the reason you came to the hospital that night?" "Yes, sir, an urgent donor request." "You responded immediately?" "Yes, sir." He nodded, without knowing who needed the blood. "Yes, sir." Dwyer shifted slightly. "Sir, if I may." "Of course," Colonel Warren replied. Dwyer leaned forward. "Major Bennett's initiative is commendable. However, she departed base without coordination, which raised concerns about readiness coverage. I reassigned her temporarily while we reviewed." Warren raised a hand gently, not interrupting so much as guiding the conversation. "Understood. And was any mission compromised?" "No, sir." "Any delay in logistics operations?" "No, sir." "Any operational risk realized?" Dwyer hesitated. "No, sir, but—" Then the only issue, Warren said quietly, was procedural deviation. "Yes, sir." The general leaned back, studying the folder. "Major Bennett, did you believe your decision violated protocol?" "Yes, sir, I knew it wasn't coordinated." "And you made the decision anyway?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of the room. I chose my words carefully. "Because someone was bleeding, sir, and I could help. Waiting for approval would have taken time." Warren nodded slowly, as if confirming something already decided. "That's what I thought." Dwyer's expression tightened slightly. "Sir, discipline." "Matters," Warren finished. "Yes, Colonel, discipline always matters." He closed the folder. "So does judgment." He turned back to me. "The patient that night was my grandson." The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. I felt the air shift again. Dwyer blinked, caught off guard. "He was in surgery," Warren continued. "Internal bleeding. My daughter posted the donor request when supplies ran low. Your donation arrived within minutes." He paused. It bought them time. I swallowed, unsure what to say. "You didn't know who he was," Warren said. "You didn't know who I was. You simply saw a need and acted." His gaze moved briefly to Dwyer. "That's not recklessness. That's leadership." Dwyer sat very still. "Sir, I didn't." "I know," Warren said calmly. "You applied the regulation. That's your responsibility, but regulations exist to serve people, not replace judgment." He folded his hands again. Major Bennett made a decision that balanced risk and humanity. She accepted the consequences. That's exactly the kind of officer we want making calls in uncertain situations. The room remained quiet. I felt a mix of relief and disbelief, though I kept my expression neutral. Warren continued. "I requested her file after the hospital visit. Her record reflects consistent performance crisis logistics experience and no prior deviations." He looked directly at Dwyer. Reassignment to administrative duty seems disproportionate. Dwyer nodded slowly. Understood, sir. Warren's voice softened slightly. Colonel, I'm not here to criticize. You followed procedure. But we also need to recognize when an officer demonstrates sound moral judgment. He turned to me again. Major Bennett, would you make the same decision again? Yes, sir, I answered without hesitation. A faint smile touched his lips. Good. He reached for the folder, slid a document forward, and spoke evenly. Effective immediately, the temporary reassignment is lifted. Major Bennett will return to operational planning. Additionally, I'm recommending her for humanitarian coordination duty within the medical logistics framework. Her instincts are suited for it. Dwyer nodded. Yes, sir, I'll implement that. Warren stood the movement unhurried but decisive. Thank you, Colonel. He turned toward me, extending his hand. Major Bennett, you didn't just help my family. You reminded me why we wear this uniform. His grip was firm, steady. Thank you. Thank you, sir, I replied quietly. As he released my hand, the tension in the room eased. Dwyer cleared his throat. Major report to operations after this. We'll reintegrate you immediately. Yes, sir. Warren gave a final nod, then moved toward the door. The sunlight caught the silver stars again, bright against the dark fabric. As he stepped into the hallway, the weight of the moment settled in fully. 2 weeks earlier, he had been just another man in a quiet donor room. Now his presence had shifted my entire trajectory. I sat there a moment longer, absorbing the change. Dwyer glanced at me, his expression more thoughtful than before. Major Bennett, he said quietly, good call that night. Yes, sir. Outside, the corridor seemed brighter, the noise of the base returning in waves. I walked toward operations, the familiar hum of engines drifting through the open doors. The reassignment was over. The quiet exile had ended. And somewhere down the hall, the man who had only asked my name was leaving 4 stars on his shoulders, carrying with him the echo of a decision made in a hospital chair. By the time I stepped back into the operations bay, the familiar sounds felt sharper than I remembered. Radios crackled with route updates, forklifts hummed across concrete, and a cargo truck idled near the loading dock, its diesel engine vibrating through the floor. For 2 weeks I'd watched this rhythm from behind glass. Now I was inside it again, and everything felt slightly different, lighter, but also heavier with meaning. Lieutenant Harris spotted me first. You're back, he asked, surprise plain in his voice. Looks that way. He nodded, a small grin forming. About time. I moved toward my workstation, sliding into the chair that still bore my nameplate. The surface was unchanged maps, routing sheets, a mug I'd forgotten to take home, but the perspective felt subtly shifted. The reassignment had compressed time-turning routine into reflection. Now each detail seemed more deliberate. A few minutes later, Commander Dwyer entered the bay. Conversations quieted slightly, not out of tension but curiosity. He walked directly toward me. Major Bennett, he said, your reassignment is formally rescinded. You'll resume convoy oversight effective immediately. Additionally, we're establishing a humanitarian response liaison within logistics. I want you to lead the initial framework. Yes, sir. He paused, then added quietly, the general made a compelling point. We need officers who understand both regulation and judgment. I'll do my best, sir. I know you will. He gave a brief nod and moved on. The room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but I felt the shift in how people looked at me. Not dramatic, just subtle respect where curiosity had been. Miller approached a few minutes later, hands in his pockets. Guess compassion made it into the SOP after all, he said. Guess so. He studied me a moment. I didn't know who you helped. Neither did I. He nodded once. Still, takes conviction. His tone lacked the earlier edge. Welcome back. Thank you. He walked off, leaving the faint smell of coffee behind. The exchange was brief, but it closed a quiet circle. The skepticism had softened into acknowledgement. That afternoon, I immersed myself in planning. Route charts spread across the desk, I coordinated supply movement for a coastal training exercise. The familiar process steadied me, fuel calculations, timing windows, contingency routes. It felt like slipping back into a well-worn uniform. Yet beneath the routine, something else lingered, the knowledge that a small decision had reached beyond my immediate world. Near sunset, Alvarez stopped by. Heard you're spearheading a humanitarian coordination role. That's the plan. She smiled faintly. Fits you. Logistics isn't just about numbers. It's about people getting what they need before it's too late. I'm starting to see that more clearly. She nodded. Good, then you'll do well. After she left, I finished the day's reports and stepped outside. The sky over Norfolk glowed amber, the harbor reflecting streaks of gold. A breeze rolled in from the water, carrying the smell of salt and distant engines. I walked toward the pier boots, echoing softly on the wooden planks. I wasn't expecting anyone. The quiet felt earned. But halfway down the pier, I saw him, General Warren, standing near the railing, hands clasped behind his back, watching the horizon. He turned slightly as I approached. Major Bennett, he said, I thought I might find you out here. Sir. He gestured toward the water. Beautiful evening. Yes, sir. We stood side by side, the silence comfortable. The harbor lights flickered on one by one, reflecting in the darkening water. After a moment, he spoke. My grandson is recovering well, he said. He asked about the person who donated. I told him her name. I'm glad he's okay, sir. He will be. Warren paused. You know, when I arrived at the hospital that night, I didn't expect anything. I just hoped someone would come. Then I saw you sitting there calm, steady. It reminded me of something my first commander told me decades ago. What was that, sir? That leadership isn't measured by how well you follow orders. It's measured by what you do when orders don't exist. He glanced at me. You understood that instinctively. I considered the words. I just did what felt necessary. That's exactly why it mattered. He rested his hands on the railing. Systems are important. They keep us consistent. But they can also make us forget why we built them. You didn't forget. The wind tugged lightly at our uniforms. The sound of distant gulls drifted across the water. I've recommended a directive, he continued, encouraging humanitarian response within reasonable judgment. Nothing radical. Just a reminder that compassion isn't incompatible with discipline. That's a good balance, sir. He nodded. You inspired it. That's not something many officers do. I felt a quiet warmth at the words, tempered by humility. I didn't intend to change anything. Most meaningful changes begin that way, he replied. We watched the water in silence for a while. The last streaks of sunlight faded, leaving the harbor bathed in soft blue. Finally, he turned. I'll be leaving Norfolk tomorrow, he said. Before I go, I wanted to thank you again, not as a general, just as a grandfather. You're welcome, sir. He extended his hand. I shook it firmly, the gesture simple but significant. Keep trusting your judgment, Major Bennett, he said. The uniform needs that. Yes, sir. He walked back toward headquarters, his silhouette merging with the evening shadows. I remained at the railing, breathing in the cool air. The past 2 weeks replayed in my mind the reassignment, the quiet doubt, the sudden reversal. It felt less like a dramatic turn and more like a lesson unfolding slowly. Honor doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it moves through quiet decisions unnoticed until the right moment reveals their weight. As the last light disappeared, I turned back toward the operations building. Tomorrow would bring new assignments, new routes, new demands. But the memory of that donor chair and the man who had only asked my name would remain a quiet compass guiding future choices. The morning after General Warren left Norfolk, the base felt unchanged at first glance. The same gulls circled over the harbor, the same trucks rolled across the loading yard, the same smell of diesel and salt hung in the air. But beneath the routine, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't written on a memo or announced over the intercom. It lived in tone and posture, in the way conversations paused and resumed with a little more thought. By 800, I was already in the operations room reviewing a draft framework for the new humanitarian coordination role. It wasn't elaborate, just a structured guideline for responding to civilian emergencies within operational limits. The language was careful, balanced between discipline and discretion. The first line read, "When lives are at immediate risk, officers may act within reasonable judgment, provided operational integrity is preserved." I stared at that sentence for a long moment. 2 weeks earlier, it might have felt controversial. Now it felt simply right. Commander Dwyer stepped in quietly. "How's the draft?" "Solid start, sir. We'll need thresholds for response authority." He nodded. "Agreed. Keep it practical. No one wants vague policy." "I'll add decision criteria." He folded his arms, studying the document. "General Warren called this morning. He wants a pilot program running within 30 days. That's ambitious." "He believes in momentum." Dwyer gave a faint smile. "So do I now." After he left, I continued refining the framework. The work felt purposeful, grounded in something larger than routine logistics. Each line carried weight, the idea that compassion could coexist with structure, that initiative wouldn't automatically be punished. Midday, Harris leaned against my desk, heard about the new directive. "They're calling it the Bennett Clause." I looked up surprised. "I hope not." He chuckled. "Not official, just what people are saying." His tone softened. "It's a good thing, makes us think." "That's enough for me." He nodded and moved on. The afternoon passed quickly. By evening, the first draft circulated through command. Comments trickled in, minor adjustments, clarifications. Nothing hostile, nothing dismissive. The shift felt real. Later, I walked back to the pier. The wind was calmer than the night before, the water almost glassy. I leaned against the railing, watching a tugboat guide a cargo ship toward open water. The quiet allowed the past weeks to settle fully. The hospital, the reassignment, the 4 stars. Each piece now fit into a single line of cause and effect. A voice behind me broke the silence. "Mind if I join you?" I turned. It was Chief Morales' hands in his jacket pockets. "Not at all." He nodded toward the water. "Heard they're writing new rules because of you." "Because of a decision I corrected." "Same thing. He studied me. Funny how the small moments end up shaping the big ones." "I didn't expect anything." "No one does." He lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating his face. "Back in '98, I stopped a convoy to help a stranded bus. Got chewed out for hours. Years later, they added a clause for civilian aid. Didn't change the world, just made it a little kinder." I smiled faintly. "That's enough." He nodded. "Always is." He left after a few minutes, footsteps fading behind me. The harbor lights reflected in the water like scattered stars. I thought about the man in the donor room, how quiet the moment had been, how easily it could have passed unnoticed. Yet it had rippled outward, touching policy perception and my own path. The next morning brought another surprise. A formal email awaited in my inbox: temporary promotion to acting humanitarian logistics coordinator. The title sounded grander than the role, but the responsibility was real. I read the message twice, absorbing the change. By noon, I was briefing a small team, 2 officers, 1 civilian liaison, on emergency response coordination. The discussion felt natural, grounded in shared purpose. We mapped out potential scenarios: disaster relief, urgent medical supply runs, donor coordination with local hospitals. Each plan traced back in some quiet way to that night in the donor chair. Weeks passed, and the framework took shape. The directive became official. Training sessions began. Younger officers asked thoughtful questions. What if we're unsure? How do we balance timing? And I answered carefully, emphasizing judgment over impulse. The tone of the unit shifted gradually. Not dramatically, just enough to be felt. One afternoon, a letter arrived in interoffice mail. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Inside, a short note. "Major Bennett, my grandson is back in school. He still asks about the night you came in." I told him the truth, that a stranger chose to help without knowing who he was. He said he wants to be that kind of person someday. I thought you should know. T.W. I read it twice, then folded it carefully. No rank, no signature block, just initials. It felt more meaningful that way. I placed the letter in my desk drawer and stepped outside. The afternoon sun warmed the concrete. Trucks rolled past, engines steady. Life moved forward unchanged and yet subtly altered. Sometimes honor doesn't arrive with ceremony. Sometimes it begins in a quiet hospital chair with a simple choice to act. It grows slowly, carried by people who notice, who remember, who decide to shape the future a little differently. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever faced a moment where doing the right thing felt inconvenient or uncertain, consider sharing it. Let someone else know that small decisions matter. Tell me where you're watching from and whether you've had your own moment like this. We share these stories not for applause but to remind each other that kindness like service never truly retires. And if you'd like to hear more journeys like this, quiet acts, unexpected turns, and the dignity that follows, stay with us. Because there are many more stories waiting. My father laughed before the champagne even settled in the glasses. It wasn't loud, but it carried sharp and practiced the kind that invites other people to join before they've decided whether they should. He rested his hand on my shoulder, not gently, and said, "This is my oldest daughter. She never really did much, just went off and joined the military." A few guests chuckled politely. Someone at the table smiled too quickly. My sister froze mid-breath in her white dress. And then the groom's father stopped chewing, stared at me, and whispered, "Wait, I know her." The room didn't fall silent all at once. It folded into silence like a flag lowered slowly until no one moved at all. The reception hall smelled faintly of roses and polished wood, the kind of place that tries to look timeless by copying something older than itself. The chandeliers were low enough to feel warm, but high enough to make everyone sit straighter. My sister had chosen soft ivory tablecloths, simple centerpieces, nothing loud. She said she wanted the day to feel calm. She'd always preferred calm. Even when we were children, she smoothed arguments the way you smooth wrinkles from a dress, quietly, carefully hoping no one would notice the crease had ever been there. I sat near the end of the family table, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be overlooked. Habit more than intention. The chair was slightly uneven, one leg shorter than the others. I adjusted it with my heel until it steadied. My hands rested in my lap, fingers loosely folded, breathing measured. I'd spent years learning how to exist in rooms without disturbing them. My father had always mistaken that for smallness. He was in high spirits. Weddings did that to him. They gave him an audience, a structure he understood, speeches, introductions, roles neatly defined. He liked roles. He liked knowing who stood where. My sister was the bride, easy. The groom, a polite young man with careful manners, approved. And me, the eldest daughter who had drifted into something he never quite understood, simplified into a joke. "She's always been independent," he continued, lifting his glass as if delivering a punchline. "Never cared for normal life, just disappeared into the army. We don't see her much." A few guests laughed again, softer this time. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was uncertain, looking for permission. I didn't look up. I watched the condensation slide down my glass instead. There are moments when correcting someone feels like striking a match in a room full of paper. I'd learned not to light anything unnecessarily. Across from me, the groom's father, Mr. Whitaker, had stopped moving. He was a tall man, older posture, still sharp, despite the softness age adds around the edges. His suit fit like something he'd worn for years, not tailored for the occasion, but chosen for familiarity. He wasn't smiling. His eyes moved from my face to my hands, then back again. He leaned slightly forward as if trying to see me more clearly without making a scene. My father didn't notice. He rarely noticed when attention shifted away from him. "She never talks about what she does," he added. "Probably paperwork. That's what most military jobs are, right?" My sister's smile flickered. She glanced at me, then at the groom. The groom shifted in his chair, polite uncertainty settling over him. I could almost hear him calculating how to respect both families without stepping into something deeper. "I keep busy," I said quietly. My father chuckled. "Busy, that's one way to put it." Mr. Whitaker set down his fork. The sound was small, but it landed with unusual clarity. "Which branch?" he asked. "Army," I answered. My father waved a hand. "Nothing glamorous. She's always liked organization." Mr. Whitaker didn't laugh. He looked at the way I sat, spine straight without effort. He noticed the scar along my wrist, half hidden by my sleeve. His gaze lingered, not intrusive, just observant. The kind of attention that measures rather than judges. "You've deployed?" he asked. I nodded once. "Yes, sir." My father shifted, slightly uncomfortable now. "Everyone deploys these days, don't they?" The groom's father didn't respond immediately. He studied my face, searching for something that had nothing to do with introductions. The conversation around us thinned. Guests sensed something, though they couldn't name it yet. My sister adjusted her napkin, her hands moving faster than necessary. The bride's bouquet rested nearby, white flowers already beginning to soften at the edges. You coordinated something, Mr. Whitaker said slowly, more to himself than to me. My father laughed again, lighter forced. Coordinated, she coordinates family holidays about once every 5 years. No one joined that laugh. I felt the familiar warmth rise at the base of my neck, not anger, just awareness. My father wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to simplify me. He'd always done that. Complexity made him uneasy. Titles he understood. Quiet responsibility he didn't. Mr. Whitaker leaned back slightly, but his eyes didn't leave me. Have we met? He asked. I don't believe so, I replied. He nodded slowly, though he didn't seem convinced. The room filled again with soft chatter, but it was thinner now, like sound traveling through fog. My father lifted his glass, satisfied the moment had passed. He began telling a story about my sister as a child, how she'd organized her dolls into wedding rehearsals. Laughter returned, cautious but real. I let the conversation drift over me. Weddings are built on repetition, stories, retold roles reaffirmed. My sister laughed at the right places, her shoulders finally relaxing. The groom reached for her hand. The band tuned quietly near the stage. Everything resumed its expected rhythm. Except Mr. Whitaker kept glancing at me as if memory hovered just beyond reach. His fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled. He seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. My father leaned toward him. She's always been quiet, he said, almost apologetic now. Not like Claire. Mr. Whitaker didn't look away from me. Quiet doesn't mean small, he replied. My father smiled politely, uncertain how to respond. The comment hung in the air, gentle but firm. I took a sip of water, the glass cool against my lips. The music began softly, piano notes drifting through the room. Somewhere behind us, a chair scraped. Someone stood. My sister laughed again, brighter this time, relieved. My father relaxed, believing the moment had passed. He reached for the bread basket, offering it around the table. Then Mr. Whitaker leaned forward once more, his voice low but clear. I'm sorry, he said, but I'm almost certain. I've heard your voice before. My father chuckled, ready to deflect again, but this time no one laughed with him. The room didn't stop. It slowed like a tide, pulling back before anyone notices the water has moved. And in that space, the first thread of recognition began to tighten. The music drifted back in, gentle and careful, as if the band sensed the room had shifted and didn't want to push too hard against it. My sister leaned toward her new husband, whispering something that made him smile, but her eyes kept flickering toward me, and then toward his father. My own father returned to his bread, slicing it with deliberate calm, the way he did whenever he wanted to restore order without admitting anything had changed. Weddings are supposed to flatten history. They place everyone in neat rows, polish the past into anecdotes, and offer the illusion that families have always fit together cleanly. But sitting there, I felt the older shape of things beneath the tablecloth, years of small misunderstandings, layered quietly over each other like folded maps no one bothered to open again. My father had never known what to do with me. Claire, my sister, moved easily through rooms. She laughed when people expected laughter. She asked questions that made others feel interesting. When she was 12, she memorized the names of every guest at our neighbor's anniversary party and thanked each of them personally. My father had watched her with visible pride. She knows how to connect, he'd said. I had been outside that same evening, adjusting the loose hinge on the gate because it squeaked when the wind shifted. I preferred knowing how things worked to knowing what to say. My father saw that as distance. He never understood that it was attention. When I joined the army, he didn't argue. He just went quiet. Silence was his way of disapproval, firm, contained, hard to push against. At the time, I mistook it for acceptance. It took years to realize he had simply decided not to engage with something he couldn't categorize. You'll probably be behind a desk, he'd said once, carefully neutral. Maybe I'd replied? He nodded, relieved. That's safer. I didn't correct him then. I rarely corrected him. It wasn't that I feared disagreement. It was that I didn't need him to understand in order to do the work. Understanding felt optional. Duty did not. Across the table now, Claire's laugh softened into something more natural. The tension eased, but not entirely. Mr. Whitaker remained thoughtful, occasionally glancing toward me. My father pretended not to notice, though his posture stiffened whenever their eyes crossed. "You must be proud," Mr. Whitaker said, finally turning to my father. "Of course," my father replied quickly. "She's disciplined." It wasn't quite pride, it was acknowledgement trimmed to something manageable. "She's always been independent," he added. "Hard to keep track of." I watched the condensation gather again on my glass. Independence had always been his polite word for distance. He had preferred closeness defined by routine weekly calls, holiday visits, predictable roles. My life didn't follow that rhythm. Deployments cut time into irregular pieces. Silence wasn't absence, it was often the only thing possible. Claire reached for my hand briefly under the table, a small squeeze that said she was trying to hold the room together. I returned it gently. She had always been the bridge between us. "So what do you do exactly?" she asked, carefully casual. "Planning," I said. My father smiled, relieved at the simplicity. "See paperwork." I let that sit. The truth rarely benefits from immediate correction. Planning, after all, did involve paper maps, schedules, briefings. He wasn't entirely wrong, he just didn't see what those papers held. Mr. Whitaker leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly in concentration. "Planning," he repeated. "Operational. Sometimes?" My father shifted in his chair. "Nothing classified, I assume," he joked. I met Mr. Whitaker's gaze. "Nothing I'd discuss here." He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that felt less like curiosity and more like respect. The conversation moved on, but the weight of it lingered. I remembered another dinner years earlier when I'd come home unexpectedly between deployments. My father had asked how long I'd be staying. "A few days," I'd said. He'd nodded, then asked if I could help reorganize the garage. We spent the afternoon moving boxes. He never asked where I'd been. I never volunteered. We worked side by side, comfortable in the silence, but something unsaid hung between us like unfinished instructions. Later, he'd told Claire she's good with logistics. It was meant as praise. It sounded like limitation. Back in the reception hall, the waitstaff began clearing plates. Glasses clinked softly. The band shifted into a slower melody. My father relaxed, believing the moment of scrutiny had passed. He began recounting a story about my sister's college graduation, how she'd nearly tripped walking across the stage. Guests laughed politely. Mr. Whitaker listened, but his attention drifted. He watched how I observed the room, the exits, the spacing between tables, the movement of servers carrying trays. It wasn't conscious anymore. It was habit. Years of reading environments had shaped my focus. I noticed his noticing, and for a moment our awareness overlapped. "You've been out recently?" he asked. "Yes." "Overseas?" I nodded slightly. My father interjected, half joking. "She never says where. We just assume somewhere dusty." A few guests smiled. The remark sounded harmless, but it skimmed over years of work reduced to atmosphere. I didn't respond. There's a point where correction becomes performance. I preferred stillness. Claire's eyes softened. "She writes sometimes," she offered. "Postcards." My father chuckled. "No return address." "They get where they need to go," I said quietly. Mr. Whitaker studied me again, as if that sentence confirmed something forming in his memory. He tapped his fingers once against the table, then stilled them. The room filled with laughter from another table. The bride and groom were called for their first dance. As everyone turned toward the floor, my father leaned closer to me. "You could try smiling more," he whispered, not unkindly. "People think you're uncomfortable." "I'm not," I replied. He nodded, misunderstanding again. "You've always been serious." The lights dimmed slightly. My sister stepped onto the dance floor, her dress catching the soft glow. The room quieted, attention shifting away from us. My father relaxed further, believing the tension had dissolved. But Mr. Whitaker didn't look at the dance. He kept his eyes on me, searching the edges of memory, as if the music itself was stirring something he couldn't quite place. And slowly the past he carried began to surface. The first dance gave everyone something to look at, something safer than the quiet tension still lingering at our table. My sister moved carefully, her hand resting on her husband's shoulder, the two of them swaying more than dancing. The band played softly, the melody simple and slow. Guests leaned in their chairs, smiling, relieved to return to the expected rhythm of a wedding. But Mr. Whitaker didn't watch the dance, he watched me. Not openly, not rudely. the way someone observes a detail they don't want to lose. His eyes moved once to the exits, then back to me. I recognized the pattern immediately. It wasn't curiosity, it was assessment. I'd seen it before, rooms where introductions didn't matter, where posture spoke louder than names. People who had spent time in uncertain places developed a quiet shorthand. We noticed how others held stillness, how they tracked movement without appearing to. It wasn't something you learned in a manual, it settled into your bones over time. "You mind if I ask you something?" he said quietly. I shook my head. "Go ahead." "You left-handed?" I blinked, slightly surprised. "Sometimes." He nodded as if confirming something small but important. My father leaned back, puzzled. "What kind of question is that?" Mr. Whitaker smiled politely. "Just noticing." My father laughed softly. "She's always been observant. Probably comes from me." I didn't respond. Mr. Whitaker's gaze shifted briefly to my wrist again, the faint scar catching the chandelier light. He noticed the way I adjusted my chair without looking down, the way my eyes flicked to the dance floor, then to the door, then back. These weren't dramatic movements. They were subtle enough most people never registered them. "You track the room," he said. "I pay attention," I replied. My father waved a hand. "She's always done that, used to rearrange the dinner table so she could see both doors." "That's practical," Mr. Whitaker said. My father smiled, not catching the shift, or paranoid. I felt the familiar stillness settle in my chest. It wasn't defensive, just grounded. My sister turned slowly under the lights, her dress catching the glow. Guests applauded softly as the song ended. The band transitioned into something livelier. Chairs scraped, people stood. The room breathed again. Mr. Whitaker leaned slightly closer. "Planning," he repeated almost to himself. "Yes." "Operational planning." "Sometimes." My father sighed lightly. "You're making it sound more complicated than it is." Mr. Whitaker didn't answer him. He kept his eyes on me. "You've coordinated evacuations." The question hung there. It wasn't accusatory, it was precise. My father chuckled. "Evacuations from what family reunions?" No one laughed this time. The space between us tightened, thin but real. "I've worked on movement plans," I said carefully. Mr. Whitaker nodded slowly. "High-pressure environments." "Yes." My father shifted in his chair. "Everyone in the military deals with pressure." "That's true," Mr. Whitaker agreed, "but not everyone sounds calm when they talk about it." I felt my sister glance at me again. The groom stood nearby, greeting relatives, unaware of the quiet shift still unfolding at our table. The lights dimmed slightly and waiters began clearing glasses. Mr. Whitaker's fingers rested on the table still now. "Have we spoken before?" he asked. "I don't think so." "Over comms, maybe?" My father frowned. "Comms." "Communications," Mr. Whitaker clarified. My father nodded, trying to follow. "Right, radios." The word radios lingered. Mr. Whitaker leaned back, eyes narrowing, as if replaying something in his mind. His posture straightened slightly, almost unconsciously. The kind of adjustment that comes when memory aligns with recognition. "You ever brief joint operations?" he asked. "Yes." My father laughed softly, almost nervous now. "You're interrogating her." Mr. Whitaker smiled politely. "Just conversation." The music swelled as more guests joined the dance floor. My sister laughed, finally relaxed. The bride's mother wiped her eyes. The room felt warm again. But at our table, something quieter continued. Mr. Whitaker studied my face, searching for confirmation beyond words. "Your voice," he said slowly. "It's steady." "I try to be." "You speak like someone who expects people to listen." "I speak clearly." My father shook his head lightly. "She's always been serious." Mr. Whitaker nodded, but his eyes stayed on me. "Serious keeps people alive." The sentence landed softly, but it changed the air. My father didn't respond. He reached for his glass, then set it down again without drinking. I remembered the first time someone had told me that tone mattered more than volume. It had been during a night exercise, radios crackling, uncertainty everywhere. Calm wasn't optional, it was contagious. If you held it, others followed. If you lost it, everything unraveled. Mr. Whitaker leaned forward again. "You ever work with Kandahar operations?" he asked. The question was almost casual, but precise enough to narrow the world. "Yes," I said. My father blinked. "That's in Afghanistan, right?" Yes. He nodded slowly, didn't know that. I don't talk about locations, I replied. Mr. Whitaker's gaze sharpened. Northern Corridor. I didn't answer immediately. Silence sometimes says enough. He inhaled slowly. His eyes moved across my face again, then down to my hands. He seemed to be fitting pieces together, each one small, but forming a clearer picture. My father shifted, uncomfortable now. You're making her sound like something out of a movie. No, Mr. Whitaker said quietly. I'm recognizing someone. The band paused between songs. For a brief moment, the room filled with only low conversation. My sister stepped away from the dance floor, laughing with her husband. She didn't see what was unfolding at our table. Mr. Whitaker leaned back, his expression thoughtful, but no longer uncertain. The recognition was close now, just beyond words. He looked at me, not as a guest, but as someone he had encountered in a different context entirely. I remember, he said softly. My father laughed lightly, trying to dissolve the tension. You remember what? Mr. Whitaker didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed fixed, steady, respectful. The kind of look soldiers exchange when memory finally aligns with truth. And the room, though still filled with music and movement, began to narrow around that quiet realization. The music started again, but it felt distant, like it belonged to another room. Mr. Whitaker didn't move. He sat with the stillness of someone who had reached a conclusion and was deciding whether to say it out loud. My father shifted in his chair, uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name. He glanced toward the dance floor, toward the bar, toward anything that might return the evening to something familiar. You remember what he asked again, trying for casual? Mr. Whitaker didn't look at him. He looked at me. His voice when he spoke was quiet enough that only our table could hear. You coordinated the northern evacuation, he said. The words landed without drama, but they rearranged the space between us. My father blinked, unsure what he'd just heard. I kept my hands folded, my breathing steady. I didn't confirm or deny. Sometimes recognition doesn't require either. I'm sorry, my father said, forcing a small laugh. Evacuation from where? Mr. Whitaker exhaled slowly. Kandahar, 2 years ago. Weather closed in early, communications unstable. They pulled units out overnight. He paused. The voice guiding that operation sounded exactly like hers. My father looked at me, then back at him. That's a big assumption. It is, Mr. Whitaker agreed, but I don't forget voices like that. The groom had returned to the table now, his jacket unbuttoned, his expression relaxed from the dance. He sensed something immediately, the way people do when conversation tightens unexpectedly. Everything okay? He asked. His father nodded slightly, just talking. The groom glanced at me politely. Dad was in logistics support for years, he explained. He remembers operations. Not logistics, Mr. Whitaker corrected gently. Coordination. The groom's posture shifted, subtle but noticeable. He looked at me more carefully now, as if the introduction had changed. My father laughed again, softer this time. You're giving her too much credit. Mr. Whitaker didn't respond to him. There was a call, he continued, speaking more to me than to anyone else. Late, calm, no wasted words. She said, move in sequence. Don't rush. The storm will hide you. He paused, searching my face. I remember thinking, whoever that was, she understood fear without feeding it. The room around us continued its gentle celebration. Glasses clinked, someone laughed near the bar, but at our table the air tightened like the moment before rain. My father shook his head lightly. You're remembering someone else. I might be, Mr. Whitaker admitted, but I don't think so. The groom leaned forward slightly. Dad, are you saying... Mr. Whitaker nodded once. I'm saying she sounds exactly like the officer who planned that extraction. My father's smile faltered. He looked at me again, searching for denial. I offered none. Silence has its own gravity. That was a big deal, the groom asked. Mr. Whitaker's eyes softened. My son was on that route, he said quietly. The groom froze. What? You never knew the name, Mr. Whitaker continued. Most didn't. But we were told the plan came from a senior officer who stayed on comms until the last vehicle cleared. He inhaled slowly. That voice stayed with me. My father's hand tightened around his glass. You're saying she... I'm saying I recognize her, Mr. Whitaker replied. The groom looked at me now with open curiosity, no longer polite distance. "Were you involved in that?" he asked. I met his gaze. I worked on operations during that period. It wasn't confirmation. It wasn't denial. It was enough. My father shifted, discomfort growing. She never mentioned anything like that. "I didn't know you were asking," I said quietly. Mr. Whitaker leaned back, absorbing the moment. His posture straightened slightly, instinct rather than intention. The groom mirrored him unconsciously, shoulders squared, attention sharpened. "You're the woman they talked about," Mr. Whitaker said finally. The sentence settled over the table. My father stared at me, confusion and realization mixing slowly. Around us, the band transitioned into a faster song. Guests clapped. The dance floor filled again. But the space around our table remained still. "I don't know about that," I replied. He nodded, accepting the deflection. "You wouldn't." The groom exhaled slowly. "If that's true, then—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Some thoughts don't need completion." My father cleared his throat. "This is surprising." "Yes," Mr. Whitaker agreed. Silence followed, not awkward but thoughtful. My sister approached the table, her cheeks flushed from dancing. "Everything okay?" she asked, smiling. "Of course," my father said quickly. Mr. Whitaker nodded politely. "Just talking." She looked between us, sensing something but not pressing. "They're about to cut the cake," she said. "You coming?" We all nodded. Chairs shifted. The spell loosened slightly, but the awareness remained. As we stood, Mr. Whitaker moved first, instinctively allowing me space. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but it carried meaning. My father noticed, his brow furrowed, trying to understand why. The cake was wheeled out white and simple. My sister laughed as the knife hovered awkwardly between them. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room. The moment felt ordinary again, but under the surface, something had changed. Mr. Whitaker watched quietly, his expression thoughtful. The groom glanced at me once more, respect beginning to replace curiosity. My father stood beside me, silent, his earlier jokes fading in the weight of new understanding. Recognition doesn't arrive with noise. It settles. It shifts posture. It changes the way people hold space. And as the cake was cut, and the room cheered, the realization that had begun at our table continued to spread quietly like light, moving across the floor. The cake was served in neat, careful slices, each plate identical, as if symmetry might hold the evening together. My sister moved from table to table, thanking guests, her smile warm but measured. The groom followed close behind her, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back. They looked exactly like what everyone expected, a beginning uncomplicated and bright. At our table, the shift remained. My father sat quieter now, his shoulders slightly drawn in as if reconsidering the outline he had drawn for me over the years. Mr. Whitaker spoke little, but his posture held a subtle respect that hadn't been there before. It wasn't formal. It was quieter than that, room-making space-aware. The groom returned first, sliding into his chair. He looked at me carefully, no longer casual. "You really worked on that operation?" he asked, his tone more thoughtful than curious. "I worked on many," I replied. "That one mattered," Mr. Whitaker said softly. My father cleared his throat. "You keep saying that? What exactly happened?" Mr. Whitaker rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced. A convoy needed to move out before a storm closed the corridor. Timing was narrow, routes were compromised. Whoever planned it adjusted everything in real time. He paused. They kept everyone calm. My father glanced at me. "And you're saying she—" "I'm saying the voice sounded like hers," Mr. Whitaker repeated. I let the conversation settle. Memory, I'd learned, carries more weight when allowed to breathe. The groom leaned forward. "Dad never talks about that deployment," he said quietly. "Just that it was complicated." "It was," Mr. Whitaker replied. "We lost contact twice. Confusion spreads quickly when that happens." But the voice stayed steady. No rush, no panic. He looked at me again. She said, "Move in sequence. Don't outrun the plan." I remember thinking, whoever that is, she understands people. The room around us filled with laughter from another table. Someone called for more champagne. The band tuned again, but the space between us held still. My father shifted. "You never mentioned any of this." "I don't usually," I said. "Why not?" Because it's work. He frowned slightly. That's more than work. Sometimes I replied. Mr. Whitaker nodded. The best work rarely announces itself. The groom exhaled slowly. If that was you, then you helped bring our unit home. I didn't respond immediately. The past isn't something you place on a table like an object. It's quieter, carried in small details, radio-static headlights and dust voices layered over each other. I did my job, I said. Mr. Whitaker's gaze softened. That's exactly what she said over comms. My father looked between us, confusion giving way to something slower. You were in charge? Planning, I repeated. That sounds like more than paperwork, he murmured. It usually is. Silence settled again. My sister returned, her veil slightly loosened now. You all look serious, she said gently. Just talking, I replied. She smiled at me, her eyes searching. You okay? Yes. She squeezed my shoulder lightly and moved on, trusting the answer. She had always trusted silence more than explanations. My father leaned back, studying me as if seeing something unfamiliar. You've always been calm, he said. It helps. You didn't even react when I introduced you earlier. I didn't need to. He nodded slowly. I thought you didn't care. I did, I said quietly, just not in a loud way. Mr. Whitaker shifted slightly. She didn't sound loud over comms either. Calm carries further. The groom smiled faintly. That makes sense. My father looked down at his hands as if replaying the evening. I said you just went off and joined the military. He exhaled. That sounds small now. It's still true, I replied. But incomplete. Yes. He nodded, absorbing that. The room filled again with movement as guests returned to dancing. My sister laughed near the floor. The lights softened. The night moved forward. Mr. Whitaker lifted his glass slightly, not quite a toast. There were a lot of families waiting that night, he said. Some never knew who made the call. He paused. That's how it should be, I suppose. Names aren't the point, I said. No, he agreed. Outcomes are. The groom looked at me with quiet respect now. Thank you, he said simply. I shook my head. You don't owe me anything. He smiled faintly. Maybe not, but I understand something now. My father watched the exchange, the pieces settling slowly. Pride, confusion, and regret mixed in his expression. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said quietly, You could have told me. I could have, I agreed, but you never asked. He absorbed that without argument. The band shifted to another song. Guests clapped. The evening continued. But at our table, the story that had never been told finally existed. Quiet, unembellished, carried in the space between recognition and understanding. And my father for the first time began to see the shape of what he had never looked for. The reception hall had grown warmer as the evening settled, in the kind of warmth that comes from too many conversations layered over each other. Laughter rose and fell in waves, glasses clinked, and somewhere near the bar someone told a story loud enough to draw a small circle of listeners. My sister and her husband moved slowly from table to table. Hands intertwined their smiles, tired but genuine. The celebration was continuing exactly as it should. My father stood abruptly. It wasn't dramatic, just deliberate. He adjusted his jacket, then glanced toward me. Walk with me, he said quietly. I nodded. We moved toward the side doors that opened to a small terrace. The air outside was cooler, carrying the faint scent of grass and distant traffic. String lights hung above the patio, their glow soft and steady. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet felt different from the silence we'd shared in years past. This one wasn't avoidance, it was recalibration. You should have told me, he said finally. I leaned against the railing, watching the lights from the parking lot beyond. You never asked. He exhaled slowly. I didn't know there was anything to ask. That's fair. He rubbed his jaw, a habit he had when thinking through something he didn't like. All this time. I thought you were doing paperwork. I was, I said, just not only that. He nodded, absorbing the nuance. And that operation, that man's son. I wasn't alone, I replied. That's not what I mean. He looked at me, really looked as if measuring the years he had simplified. You were responsible. Part of a team. He shook his head slightly. You always do that. You make yourself smaller. I make the work bigger, I corrected gently. The string lights swayed faintly in the breeze. Inside, the music shifted to something slower. Through the glass doors, we could see couples drifting across the dance floor. "I joked about you," he said quietly. "Yes. I didn't realize." "I know." He leaned on the railing beside me, his posture less rigid than usual. "You didn't even react." "I didn't need to." "That must have hurt." "I considered that. Not the way you think. I'm used to being misunderstood. It's quieter than anger." He nodded slowly. "I always thought you were distant." "I was working." "That's not the same." "No, I agreed, but it can look that way." He looked down at his hands. "I was proud when you joined. I just didn't know what it meant." Claire's life was easier to understand. Weddings, jobs, routines. Yours was abstract. "I didn't need you to understand," I said. "But I should have tried." The admission hung between us. It wasn't dramatic. It was careful, like placing something fragile on a table. "You taught me discipline," I said. "You taught me to keep calm. That helped more than you know." He looked surprised. "I did." "Yes." He nodded slowly, absorbing the idea that influence doesn't always look like agreement. I still wish I'd asked more. "You can now." He smiled faintly. "What would I ask?" "Whatever you're curious about." He considered that. "Were you scared?" "Sometimes." "And you sounded calm." "That's the job." He exhaled softly. "I used to think bravery meant speaking loudly. I'm starting to think it's the opposite." I watched the lights shimmer across the parking lot. Calm lets people breathe. He nodded. "That man inside, he respected you." "Yes." "And I made you sound like you hadn't done anything." "You didn't know." "That doesn't make it right." "No, I agreed, but it makes it human." He looked at me, his expression softer now. "I'm proud of you." The words came quietly without ceremony. They settled deeper than anything louder could have. I nodded once. "Thank you." He hesitated. "I don't know how to talk about the rest, the rank, the responsibility." "You don't have to." "I want to understand." "You'll understand enough." He smiled faintly. "You always speak like that, precise." "It keeps things clear." We stood there for a moment, the cool air steady around us. Inside, applause rose briefly, then faded. The wedding was continuing, but something between us had shifted. "I introduced you wrong," he said finally. "You introduced me the way you understood me." "I'd like to fix that." "You don't have to." "I want to." I nodded. "Then do it in your own way." He straightened slightly, not rigid, just resolved. "Come back inside," he said. We walked together toward the doors. As we stepped back into the warmth and music, I noticed something subtle. He slowed slightly, allowing me to enter first. It wasn't formal. It was instinctive. Recognition doesn't always look like applause. Sometimes it's just space. And as we returned to the reception, the distance that had existed for years felt smaller, not erased, but finally understood. When we stepped back into the reception hall, the music had softened into something slower, the kind of song people choose when the night begins to lean toward memory instead of celebration. Couples swayed close together. The lights were dimmer now, the chandeliers glowing like warm embers. My sister sat at the sweetheart table, shoes off, laughing quietly with her husband. The day had settled into that gentle hour when weddings stop performing and begin breathing. My father paused beside me before we returned to the table. His posture was different, not rigid, not uncertain, just thoughtful. He scanned the room once, then nodded slightly as if confirming something to himself. We took our seats. Mr. Whitaker glanced up, offering a small, respectful smile. The groom did the same. The conversation around us flowed again, but softer now, as though the evening had learned to listen. A few minutes passed. My father folded his napkin carefully, then set it down. He looked toward the stage where the band was adjusting microphones. The best man had just finished a toast, and the room settled into that pause before the next speaker. My father stood. It wasn't abrupt, it was deliberate calm. He walked toward the stage, speaking quietly to the band leader. The microphone squeaked once, then steadied. Guests turned, expecting another routine toast, perhaps a thank you, perhaps a story about my sister as a child. My sister looked surprised but smiled. "Dad," she whispered. He nodded gently, then faced the room. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply looked at the gathered faces, friends, relatives, strangers, now joined by celebration. When he began, his voice was steady. "I've already had my father of the bride moment," he said, "so I'll keep this short." A few guests chuckled lightly. I realized tonight, he continued, that I introduced someone wrong earlier, and when you introduce someone wrong, you don't fix it quietly, you fix it properly. The room grew still. My sister glanced at me, her expression curious. My hands rested in my lap, calm, waiting. "My oldest daughter is here tonight," he said. I joked that she hadn't done much, that she just went off and joined the military. He paused, letting the words settle. That wasn't fair, not because she needs titles and not because she'd ever mentioned them herself. It wasn't fair because I reduced a life I didn't take the time to understand. The silence deepened. He looked toward me, not dramatically, just honestly. She's spent years doing work that most of us will never see. Quiet work, careful work, the kind that keeps people safe without needing applause. He inhaled slowly. I'm proud of her. Not for any rank, not for any story, just for the calm strength she carries. She makes rooms steadier. I didn't notice that before. I do now. No one clapped immediately. The moment didn't ask for it. It rested quietly, like something placed carefully in the center of the room. My sister's eyes filled slightly, her smile soft. The groom nodded, once respectful. Mr. Whitaker lowered his gaze, acknowledging the correction. My father finished simply, "To my daughters, both of them. One beginning a new life tonight, and one who's been quietly building hers all along." He set the microphone down and stepped away. The applause that followed was gentle, not loud, but sincere. It spread slowly, table by table, until the room filled with a soft rhythm of hands meeting. I didn't stand. I didn't wave. I just inclined my head slightly, letting the moment pass through me. When he returned to the table, he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He poured himself water, his movements careful but relaxed. My sister reached over and squeezed his hand. The groom smiled warmly. Mr. Whitaker lifted his glass slightly toward me, a silent acknowledgement. The music resumed, conversations returned, but something had shifted, not dramatically, just enough. My father leaned back in his chair, glancing at me once with a quiet expression that carried more than words. The evening moved forward lighter. Later, guests began to leave. Hugs were exchanged, chairs emptied. My sister embraced me tightly. I didn't know she whispered. "You didn't need to," I replied. She smiled. "I'm proud of you anyway." "I know." The groom shook my hand, firm and respectful. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You're welcome." Mr. Whitaker approached last. "You make calm look easy," he said. "It isn't," I replied. He nodded. "That's why it matters." My father stood beside me as we watched them leave. The hall was quieter now, staff clearing glasses, folding chairs. The night had softened into something reflective. "I meant what I said," he told me. "I know." He hesitated. "I'm still learning." "So am I." We stepped outside together. The air was cooler now, the string lights dimming as the venue prepared to close. He walked me to my car, something he hadn't done in years. The gesture was simple, but it carried its own meaning. "Drive safe," he said. "I will." He nodded, then added, "Call when you get back, wherever back is." "I will." I started the engine, the headlights cutting gently across the lot. As I pulled away, I glanced once in the mirror. He stood there, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed, watching until I turned the corner. Revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes it's the moment someone who laughed learns to stand beside you instead. The room doesn't change all at once. It shifts slowly until respect settles where misunderstanding once lived. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who was underestimated or a moment when quiet strength finally spoke, tell me in the comments below. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what this made you think about. We share stories like this every day, stories about family dignity and the calm courage it takes to stand steady. So consider subscribing if you'd like to keep walking this path with us. Let's continue this journey together. They said she'd crash and burn. That was my father's prediction, cold, precise, delivered like a verdict. 2 days later, the flight deck shook as the jet screamed overhead and the loudspeaker cut through the wind. Major Singh cleared for carrier qualification. People turned. Helmets paused mid-motion. I looked up at the observation platform just as my father blinked, stunned, his certainty fracturing without a word. In that moment, with steel under my boots and the ocean breathing below, I realized something terrifying and freeing at the same time. The hardest landing I would ever make wasn't on a moving deck, it was inside my own family. Part 1: The hardest landing was home. The deck trembled under my boots as the jet roared past, a steel blur slicing Pacific air into ribbons. Heat shimmered off the gray surface, and the carrier breathed like a living thing, metal, wind, and intent. My call sign crackled through the comms, steady and impersonal. Major Singh cleared for final approach. The knot behind my ribs tightened. Not fear, focus. I'd flown this profile in simulators until the motions lived in my bones. I'd done it in drills at night in crosswinds that made other pilots wave off. But this was different. This wasn't just a landing, this was a reckoning. 24 hours earlier, I'd arrived by chopper to the USS Antares, America's newest carrier. No banners, no press. Just a nod from command and a quiet word that this demonstration mattered. The Falcon X wasn't just another aircraft. It was the future, and one pilot had been cleared to make its first public carrier qualification. Me. No one announced it. The whisper was enough. The Secretary of Defense would be watching via drone feed. Engineers were stacked 3 deep in the ready room, and someone somewhere decided it would be poetic to invite my father. I didn't care about the cameras, I cared about him. He wasn't supposed to be there. Retired admirals didn't haunt flight decks unless they were looking for ghosts. But someone at the Pentagon thought it made sense. Bring the legend. Let him watch the future. A few smiles flickered in the briefing room when they realized his daughter would be the one flying it. Nobody told him until the night before. We crossed paths by accident in the corridor, white lights, gray bulkheads, the smell of oil and coffee. He stopped, looked me up and down the way he used to look at new officers fresh out of Annapolis. Not with pride, with assessment. "They picked you," he said flatly. "That's reckless." I didn't flinch. I had learned not to. "You raised me," I replied. "If I crash, that's on you." He walked away, didn't look back. Now, standing on the deck beneath a 1,000-watt sky, I felt the carrier surge beneath me, waves slapping steel far below. A junior crewman approached, nervous energy leaking through his posture. "Ma'am, fuel check complete. Tower cleared." "You're good." I nodded. No smile. My hands moved without hesitation, helmet secured, gloves adjusted. This wasn't nerves. This was training, drilled, earned. As I climbed the ladder into the cockpit, I caught sight of the observation platform, a row of dark uniforms, reflective sunglasses. Somewhere up there, my father stood with his arms folded, watching like a jury. I'd grown up in the shadow of his medals. Now he stood in mine. When I was 5, he used to kneel beside me on the living room floor, explaining what flaps did while I pushed toy planes across the carpet. He once told me, "The sky's a war zone. You don't play in it. You dominate it." Until I said I wanted to fly. Then suddenly the sky wasn't a war zone anymore. It was a boy club and I wasn't invited. I lowered my visor and switched to comms. "Falcon X, this is Tower. Wind steady. You are clear to launch." "Roger, Tower," I replied, voice crisp. Then softly, so only I could hear, "Let him watch." The catapult fired. Power surged. The deck fell away. My spine pressed into the seat as the horizon dropped and the sky opened like a theater curtain. For a heartbeat, everything went quiet inside my helmet. Then the work began. The first maneuver, tight loop over the bow, clean. The second, rapid roll, precise. The Falcon X responded like it knew me, like it trusted my hands. Observers scanned, measured, waited for something to go wrong. I heard one voice in my head above all others. "You don't have the instinct." That's what he used to say. I did. I just didn't have his approval. Final descent. Velocity steady. Wheels down. Hook armed. The deck came into view like a strip in a dream, narrow, alive, unforgiving. I leveled, slowed, centered. "Falcon X approaching arrestor cables," I called. 3, 2. The hook caught clean. The jet slowed on command. No bounce, no jolt, just silence and then applause from the deck crew, sharp and surprised. A voice boomed over the loudspeaker, one I didn't recognize. First Falcon X-Carrier qualification record precision. Major Singh. I exhaled. Not from strain, from relief. For once I hadn't proven them wrong. I'd simply proven me right. I climbed down with my helmet tucked under my arm. My boots touched steel. I looked up. He wasn't clapping, he wasn't smiling, he was just staring. That was enough for now. I wasn't born into an ordinary family. I was born in base housing in Norfolk, Virginia. My lullabies were jet engines. My first memories were starched uniforms and briefing rooms. My father wasn't just a naval officer, he was the architect behind long-range air strategy in the late 2000s. When he spoke, commanders listened. When he entered a room, people stood. Even my teachers called him sir. At home, he was the wind and the law. I was 10 when I first said I wanted to fly. He'd just returned from a Pacific deployment, still in his whites. I sat cross-legged on the floor, gluing together a plastic Hornet model, one wing crooked. Someday, I said without looking up, I'll fly the real one. There was a pause. Then a chuckle, short, dismissive. You're smart, he said. Flying isn't your path. Why not? He crouched, lowered his voice. It's not built for you. Something inside me curled tight and quiet. It stayed that way for years. At 17, I had the grades, the athletic record, the recommendations. I sent my application to the academy without asking. When the acceptance came, I thought just maybe he'd smile. He poured a scotch and stared at the wall. You'll waste your potential, he muttered. You could have designed aircraft. Instead, you want to play soldier in the sky. That was the first time I left the table before the plates were cleared. Standing on the deck now, applause fading into routine, I realized this landing wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a much harder approach, one that had nothing to do with wind or wire, and everything to do with blood and silence. I adjusted my grip on the helmet and squared my shoulders. The sea doesn't care about lineage, it only respects the landing. So would I. I didn't remember learning to sleep through jet noise. It was just there, constant, familiar, like breathing. Base housing in Norfolk had a rhythm, reveille mornings, the hiss of steam irons on pressed uniforms, the low thunder of engines warming before dawn. Other kids had lullabies, I had afterburners. The walls rattled, the windows hummed, and nobody complained because that sound meant purpose. It meant people were doing their jobs. My father was already a presence before he was a person. His shadow reached rooms before he did. When he entered, a space conversation adjusted itself. Chairs straightened, voices softened. Even at home, the rules felt written in invisible ink. Don't interrupt, don't fidget, don't ask questions that weren't already answered. When I was little, he could be gentle in narrow windows of time, Sunday afternoons usually. He'd sit cross-legged on the living room floor with me, his back against the couch, a mug cooling in his hand, while I pushed plastic planes across the carpet. He explained flaps and lift with patience, then tracing arcs in the air, letting me make mistakes. I loved those hours because they felt like permission. I was 10 when I said it out loud. He'd just come back from a Pacific deployment, white still crisp, shoes polished. He stood over me as I worked on a model Hornet, one wing glued crooked. I was concentrating so hard my tongue pressed against my teeth. Someday, I said without looking up, I'm going to fly the real one. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that makes your shoulders inch up before you realize it. Then he laughed, short, contained, like he'd heard a clever joke. You're smart, he said, but flying isn't your path. I looked up, confused more than hurt. Why not? He crouched beside me, voice lowered, like this was a secret meant to protect me. Because it's not built for you. Carrier aviation takes instinct, aggression. You don't have to prove anything by chasing it. I nodded because nodding was safer than arguing, but something inside me folded in on itself and stayed there, quiet, tight. My mother didn't interrupt. She never did. She stood in the doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder, eyes warm, reading the room the way she always had. Later, when he'd gone to his study, she sat beside me and adjusted the crooked wing. It doesn't have to be perfect to fly, she said. Then she kissed the top of my head and went back to the kitchen. At school, teachers spoke to me carefully once they learned my last name. Some smiled too wide, others overcorrected. Singh's daughter, they'd say, like it was a credential I could use if I wanted. I learned early how to be small in public and precise in private. By 17, my report card looked like a contract. Advanced placement everything, varsity track, letters of recommendation that spoke about discipline and focus and calm under pressure. I filled out my application to the academy at night, door closed, desk lamp low. I didn't ask. I mailed it and went to sleep. The acceptance letter came on a Wednesday. Thick envelope, heavy seal. I held it for a long time before opening it, the way you hold something fragile when you don't know yet if it will break. I imagined handing it to him. I imagined the nod, the smile that never came easily. He didn't read it when I gave it to him. He poured a scotch, sat down, stared at the wall. "You'll waste your potential," he said finally. "You could have gone anywhere. Stanford, MIT. You could design aircraft instead of risking your life in one. You want to play soldier in the sky." "I don't want to play," I said. "I want to fly." He waved a hand, dismissing the difference. "You don't understand what you're choosing." I stood up before the plates were cleared. That was new. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I just left. My mother didn't follow. She never chased storms. At Annapolis, the air smelled like stone and river water and ambition. The days were long and exacting. The rules were clear. I thrived in that clarity. Aeronautical engineering clicked for me the way music clicks for other people. Math was honest. Physics didn't care who my father was. When I applied for the flight pipeline, my advisor leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. "You're a natural," he said. "But understand this, your name will work against you before it works for you." I wrote my father a letter by hand, told him I'd been selected for flight training at Pensacola. I chose my words carefully. I told him I was ready. I told him I would work harder than anyone. I told him I hoped one day he'd see why this mattered to me. His reply came as a single email, no greeting, no signature. "Stop embarrassing the Singh name." On my first day of flight school, I wore my uniform like armor. The hangar was loud and bright, the air thick with fuel and nerves. Most of my classmates were men, tall, confident, loud in the way people get when they're afraid to be quiet. The instructor, a grizzled pilot with salt and pepper hair, scanned the line. When he reached me, he paused. "You'd better be sharp," he said. "This isn't Top Gun with subtitles." Some of the guys laughed. I didn't. I met his eyes. "Yes, sir." Training was brutal. G-forces crushed my ribs. Instruments blurred after hour 6. I threw up more than once after landing, wiped my mouth, and went back to the debrief. My hands blistered from the throttle. My neck ached. I didn't call home to complain. I called my mother sometimes late when the lights were out. "Are you eating?" she'd ask. Enough, I'd say, which was almost true. One night a small package arrived. No note. Inside was a thin silver compass on a chain. I wore it under my flight suit from then on. When the world spun too fast, I'd touch it. North, south, home. By the second month, my numbers spoke for me. Recovery maneuvers, emergency protocols, night landings, clean, precise. Still. Compliments were rare. Raised eyebrows weren't. After a flawless night drill, one instructor pulled me aside. "You have talent," he said, "but you'll have to be better than good to be taken seriously, especially with that last name." I knew what he meant. Not Singh, Admiral Singh. I wasn't trying to be him. I was trying to be seen. By the time I earned my wings, exhaustion felt like a language I spoke fluently. It lived in my shoulders, my wrists, the quiet ache behind my eyes that never quite went away. Graduation day was bright and ceremonial, the kind of day people took photos for. I smiled when required. I shook hands. I folded the paper and put it away. Pride came later alone when no one was watching. Carrier qualification orders arrived in a plain manila folder. No fanfare. Out of 48 trainees, 8 were selected. One woman, me. Someone had scribbled a call sign in the corner in faded ink. Echo. I didn't know then how much that name would matter, or how often it would follow me into places where sound disappeared and decisions had to be made anyway. The first time I stepped onto a carrier in full gear, awe hit before fear. The deck was a moving city steel noise choreography. Jets screamed past with inches to spare. Crew moved with practiced urgency hands, signaling bodies pivoting like they'd rehearsed for years. And then there was the weight. The knowledge that every mistake echoed louder out here. That the ocean didn't forgive. VFA 192, the Golden Dragons didn't welcome me. They didn't have to. Tradition did that work for them. When I reported to the ready room, a few heads turned, an eyebrow lifted. That was it. No applause, no handshake, just indifference wrapped in legacy. Carrier landings weren't like the simulators. Everything was faster, louder, sharper. The margin for error felt thin enough to cut skin. On my first attempt, a crosswind shoved me sideways, and I waved off, heart thudding against my ribs. The second try wasn't much better. That night I skipped the mess and sat alone in the maintenance bay replaying HUD footage until my eyes burned. A pilot with the call sign Slingshot walked past, coffee in hand. He stopped, leaned against a tool chest, and watched the screen with me. Even the best miss the wire on day one, he said, not unkindly. You'll get it. Or you won't. Then he left. No pep talk, no sympathy, just truth. I got it on the third try. It wasn't pretty, it was safe. The next 10 were better, cleaner, centered, consistent. Still, no one said much. Silence can be a test. I learned to pass it. I listened more than I talked. I watched how pilots flinched on final approach, how nerves showed up in micro-adjustments. I offered tips quietly, never in front of others. Respect came slowly, the way trust does when it isn't demanded. At night, I followed my father's career from a distance. He was lecturing now, writing guest panels on defense theory. His words carried weight. His name still opened doors. He published an article on emergent threat dynamics in naval airspace. I read it twice. He never mentioned me, not once. Then came the day everything tilted. We were flying a 4-jet pattern over the South China Sea when one of our pilots lost electrical stability mid-air. I was fourth in the stack. I saw the engine flame out, watched his wing dip violently. There wasn't time to think. I slid under him, matched speed, relayed comms, talked him through it. My voice stayed level, my hands stayed steady. We brought him back. On deck, the chief said I'd saved a $70 million aircraft and a life. No ceremony, no medal. Just a nod. That night, Slingshot sat beside me during dinner. "You're the one I'd want next to me in a nosedive," he said. I didn't answer, but something in my chest loosened. Weeks later, a package arrived from home. Manila folder, my mother's handwriting. Inside was a clipped article, my father's latest op-ed. Halfway through, he quoted an unnamed pilot: "Flight doesn't belong to arrogance. It belongs to those who survive crosswinds." I read it 5 times. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. I emailed him one line: "We survived the crosswinds, still flying." He didn't reply. Months stacked into deployments. My name appeared on lists again and again. Inside the squadron, I became the quiet constant. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, the one who didn't rattle. Outside it, I was mostly invisible. At a strategy conference, I overheard 2 senior officers near the coffee station. "Echo's solid," one said. "Too quiet," the other replied. "Her dad would have eaten her alive." I grabbed my coffee and said, without looking back, he tried. The sea respects only the landing. I learned that truth the hard way off the coast of Guam. Night cycle, weather turning, wind, cross-current, rain on the horizon. Command offered to delay. I said no. I don't know if it was pride or principle, maybe both. The launch was smooth. The flight was routine until fog rolled in harder than forecast. Visibility dropped fast. By the time I approached the carrier, I couldn't see the deck, just light and glare. First pass too high, waved off. Second pass almost caught the wire but bounced. Waved off again. On the third, I was low. My stomach rose into my throat. Then the voice in my headset changed. Older, calm, echo. "Pull up, take the reset. This isn't worth your name." I knew that voice, Admiral Singh. I pulled up, reset the circuit. Breathed. The 4th attempt was clean. I caught the wire and stopped dead. The deck crew applauded. I didn't hear them. I sat in the cockpit, shaking, visor fogging. The next morning, a note waited in my locker. Plain white card, no envelope. "The sky owes you nothing. You still landed. D. I didn't keep it. I didn't throw it away either. That night something shifted. Not because I nearly failed, but because I realized I didn't want to land just to prove him wrong. I wanted to land because I belonged, because I earned it. The sea didn't care who my father was. Neither did I. After Guam, my name began to circulate in places I wasn't invited into. Not loudly, not publicly. It moved the way tides do, quiet, persistent, reshaping the shoreline without announcing itself. I noticed it in small things. A seat left open beside me in the ready room, not out of politeness but expectation. A junior pilot waiting until everyone else had left before asking, "Can you look at my tape?" I said yes every time. I shifted without meaning to. Less proving, more preparing. I started showing the younger pilots how to breathe on final approach, how to let the aircraft do what it was built to do instead of wrestling it. I didn't give speeches. I gave margins, small corrections, calm words at the right second. They listened, not because I was loud, because I was steady. A year into that rhythm, a memo landed in my inbox. Pre-deployment readiness protocols needed revision. New threats, new aircraft, new pilots who had grown up on screens instead of steel. The command wanted someone to design a program that emphasized instinct under pressure. My call sign was typed neatly at the top of the draft. Echo. I stared at it for a long time, then I accepted. The work suited me. Long hours. Precise language, simulations that stripped comfort away and left only decisions. When the first training cycle ended, the mishap rate dropped. The chatter in the halls changed. Someone scribbled in Sharpie on the whiteboard outside the briefing room, "Echo Doctrine." I erased it the next morning, but the name stuck anyway. At home, silence. My mother sent occasional messages, weather updates, reminders to eat a photograph of the dog getting older. Once she wrote, "He asks about your flights sometimes. Pretends not to care." I didn't reply. Some things weren't meant to be corrected. The call came on an afternoon that smelled like hydraulic fluid and rain. Report to Command Intelligence. No explanation. When I walked into the briefing room, the binder on the table caught my eye before anything else. Project Falcon X. Clean cover, no markings. It wasn't just a new aircraft. It was a statement. 5th-generation stealth strike, autonomous support systems, sensors that could see through weather and intention. 10 years of development, $12 billion. And they needed one pilot to qualify it for carrier landings. 1. A sticky note clung to the inside cover. Candidate Major M. Singh. I looked up. Why me? The officer shrugged. You've got quiet hands? You don't rattle. That night, I sat on my bunk and stared at the hangar lights reflected on polished steel. I took the compass from under my collar and held it in my palm. My father used to say precision wasn't emotional. The sky didn't care about fairness, only results. Maybe he was right. But this wasn't just a plane. It was a promise. The Falcon X didn't take off so much as disappear. The controls felt lighter than thought, like the aircraft anticipated intention. On my first test flight over the Nevada desert, the horizon bent and returned without drama. When I landed, the engineering team clapped. The program lead, a retired commander with a titanium hip and no patience for praise, nodded once. "She can fly," he said. That was enough. The tests stacked. Rain, wind, blackout refueling, simulated EMP. The Falcon X passed. I passed with it. Clearance came with conditions most generals didn't get. Still no press, no announcements. Credit waited. 3 months later, I briefed top command at Pearl Harbor. Halfway through the presentation, I felt it before I saw it. That familiar pressure. I looked up. My father stood at the end of the table, silver hair, neat blazer, crisp like he still owned the ocean. He didn't look at me, not at first. When I referenced inverted recovery metrics, his head tilted. His eyes narrowed. After the session in the hallway, I heard him behind me. She couldn't possibly understand those specs, he said to another officer. Someone's feeding her notes. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. 2 weeks later, my call sign appeared on a locked rotation list for a high-profile demonstration. Carrier landing. Public. off the coast of San Diego. The pilot's name wouldn't be released until the moment came. Someone at the Pentagon made sure he knew. A sealed envelope arrived at my quarters. Navy crest, embossed card, venue USS Antares, Mission Falcon X Final Carrier Certification, Observer Ret ADMD Singh. I stared at it until the edges blurred. Part of me wished it didn't have to be like this. But the sea doesn't negotiate. The night before the flight, the ready room was empty. I pulled a photograph from my pocket, creased old. Me at 6, sitting on his lap in a museum beside a retired F-14. I was pointing up. He was smiling. Back then he used to say, "The sky favors the prepared." I folded the photo and put it away. Morning came heavy with fog. The transport chopper set down on the Antares rotors, slicing mist. Admirals, diplomats, senators, foreign liaisons. They gathered on the observation platform to see if the Navy's newest marvel could land on 300 feet of moving steel at 150 knots. And standing in the shadows, hands clasped behind his back, was my father. I walked to the Falcon X as the crew swarmed it for final checks. No insignia beyond rank. Compass under my collar. When I climbed into the cockpit, the canopy sealed the world into sound and breath. Major Singh cleared for launch. The catapult fired. The sea fell away. The sky opened, waiting to be cracked. The first pass was for show, a low, fast flyby that let the crowd see the aircraft's clean profile. Controlled aggression. On the second, I climbed and circled wide. The deck shrank below me, a restless postage stamp. Wind shifted. I adjusted. Breathing slowed. Final approach confirmed, Tower said. A pause. Then Major Singh, "This is your deck." The second stretched. Velocity perfect. Wire in sight. I breathed once. The wheels met steel. The hook caught the third cable. The Falcon X shuddered and stopped in under 3 seconds. Precision. The loudspeaker cut through the ship. Carrier certification successful. Major Singh, fastest Falcon X qualification on record. Applause rose, surprised and sharp. I stayed still for 5 seconds, visor down, heart steady. When I climbed out, sunlight cut through the fog. Deck crew parted without being asked. I walked across steel helmet under my arm. On the platform, my father stood frozen. His certainty, so carefully constructed, fractured. He didn't clap, he didn't move. He just stared, stunned, as the future landed clean without his permission. After the applause faded and the deck returned to its measured chaos, I retreated into the quietest place I could find, the small viewing chamber off the officers' lounge. Tinted glass looked out over the runway I had just claimed. Inside, the light was dim, the air cool, the smell a mix of coffee and cold steel. I set my helmet on the table and sat, hands resting on my thighs, waiting for the shaking to stop. It didn't come from exertion, it came from release. For years I had carried a tightness I didn't know how to name. It lived in the way I squared my shoulders before entering rooms, in the way I measured words twice before speaking, in the way I flew clean, restrained, exact, never flashy enough to invite scrutiny. I told myself it was professionalism. It was also protection. Footsteps approached. Slow, familiar. I didn't turn right away. I watched my reflection in the glass instead, flight suit creased at the elbows, hair pulled tight, eyes steady but older than I remembered. When I finally faced him, he was standing a few feet away, hands at his sides, not folded. That alone felt like a concession. "You didn't flinch," he said. It wasn't praise, it wasn't criticism, it was observation. "No," I replied, "I learned not to." He nodded once, as if filing the data away. We stood there in silence long enough for it to become a choice rather than an absence. Outside, crew moved equipment. Inside, something waited. "I told them it wasn't built for you," he said finally, eyes still on the runway. "I thought if I made it sound impossible, you'd choose safer skies." I let the words land. "You thought fear would keep me home." "I thought it would keep you alive." I turned fully toward him then. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself." He blinked. The line had landed clean. "I've watched pilots die," he said quietly. "I've signed letters to families. I didn't want to imagine your name on one of them." "I didn't ask you to imagine it," I said. "I asked you to see me." He swallowed. For a moment, the admiral, the certainty, the doctrine slipped. What stood there instead was an aging man who had spent a lifetime believing control could outrun loss. I didn't know how he admitted. Every time you climbed higher, I felt smaller, ashamed of it. I took a breath. The room smelled faintly of jet fuel carried in on my suit. "You don't owe me a perfect past," I said. "Just an honest present." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't open it right away. He held it thumb tracing the edge like he was testing the weight of what it contained. "These don't belong in a drawer anymore," he said, and opened the lid. Inside were his command wings. Silver, worn smooth by time and touch. I'd seen them once before years ago mounted in a shadow box on his study wall. He held them out to me, hands steady. I hesitated, not because I didn't want them, but because I understood what they cost. When I took them, the metal was cool against my palm. He didn't smile, neither did I. We didn't need to. Later, as the ship settled into evening and the crowd thinned, I walked back onto the flight deck alone. The sun dipped low, painting the sea in copper and blue. The arrestor cables gleamed patient and indifferent. I stood at the edge and let the wind move through me. I heard footsteps again. This time I didn't turn right away. "Was it worth it?" he asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation, "even when it wasn't." He nodded slowly. "I tried to make you quit." "I know. I thought I was protecting you." "You weren't," I said gently. "You were protecting yourself." He laughed, then not bitter, not loud, tired, real. I deserved that. We stood side by side, not close, not far. The wind did most of the talking. After a long moment, he reached into his pocket again and pulled out something small and worn. "I found this last month," he said. "It's yours." It was the photograph the museum the retired F-14 me on his lap, pointing up. The same photo I had kept folded in my locker for years. I held it like a relic. "You kept this?" I asked. "Every desk I ever had," he said. I didn't know how to say the things that mattered. Silence was easier. "It hurt," I said. "I know." I looked out at the sea. "You don't have to be loud now. Just be honest." He nodded. "Then let me start here. You didn't crash and burn. You touched down when it mattered." The words settled between us, clean, earned. That night back in my quarters, I placed his wings beside my compass on the table. Legacy and direction. Both earned, both mine now. The next morning I returned to work. No ceremony, no speeches, but people moved differently around me. Not because of who my father was, because of who I had become. Weeks later, a short clip of the Falcon X landing appeared online. No pilot named. The internet found it anyway. "That's Echo. That's Singh's daughter. She nailed it." Someone titled the video, "Precision Has a Name." I watched it once and closed the tab. A letter arrived soon after, my mother's handwriting steady on the envelope. Inside a gala program and a note: "Your father has requested you present this year's Rising Pilot Award. He says no one else knows how to recognize the quiet ones." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I wrote back. "Tell him I'll be there." Because the hardest landing wasn't behind me. It had simply taught me how to stay upright when the deck moved beneath my feet. The weeks after the demonstration passed without ceremony, but not without consequence. Recognition didn't arrive in headlines or medals. It arrived in posture, in pauses, in the way rooms adjusted themselves when I entered, not out of deference to a name, but out of expectation. People expected clarity from me now. At the next squadron briefing, the room was louder than usual, jokes bouncing, chairs scraping. But when the flight lead asked for input on night cycle adjustments, the noise softened without anyone asking it to. I spoke only when I had something to add. I always had something to add. The Falcon X telemetry sat open on the screen, lines of data translating into instinctive truth. Numbers didn't flatter, they testified. "Your final vector correction," one of the engineers said, pointing at the replay that wasn't in the automated sequence. "No," I replied. "The wind shifted. The system compensated late. I compensated early." He nodded slowly. "Only a human would have done that." That sentence followed me longer than any praise ever had. The Navy released a sanitized clip of the landing, no faces, no commentary beyond performance metrics. Still it spread. Forums dissected angles and throttle control. Retired pilots weighed in with grudging admiration. Somewhere in the noise, my call sign surfaced again and again. Echo, not shouted, repeated. At home, my mother called more often. She didn't ask about the flight. She asked about me, how I was sleeping, whether I was eating enough. Once she said he watched the clip 3 times. He didn't say anything. He made tea. I smiled at that. It felt like progress. The gala invitation sat on my counter for days. Naval Aviators Legacy Night. Rising Pilot Award. My father's request was written plainly without flourish. I imagined him standing at a podium uncomfortable in the spotlight he once commanded so easily, asking me to speak about the next generation. Quiet ones. The thought unsettled me more than any flight ever had. When the night came, the ballroom was warm with polished wood and low conversation. Dress blues replaced flight suits. I scanned the room instinctively the way I always did, exit sightlines posture. My father stood near the back, hands clasped, listening rather than speaking. When our eyes met, he nodded once. Not permission, acknowledgement. I took the stage when my name was called. The microphone hummed softly. I looked out at faces, young pilots with ambition, still sharp older ones with memories etched deep. I spoke plainly. This award isn't about being fearless, I said. It's about being steady. About doing the work when no one's watching. About landing clean when the deck is moving and the wind doesn't care who you are. I didn't look at him while I spoke. I didn't need to. When the applause came, it wasn't thunderous. It was sustained, respectful, enough. Afterward, he approached me slowly, as if the years between us were still recalibrating. You spoke well, he said. So did you, I replied. He looked surprised, then thoughtful. I learned from you. That was new. Later that night, we stood near a window overlooking the harbor. Boats drifted in quiet lines of light. He held a glass he never drank from. I spent my life believing authority came from certainty, he said. From being the loudest voice in the room. And now I see it also comes from restraint. I nodded. Restraint keeps you alive. He smiled at that, a real one, brief, earned. The next morning I was back in uniform, back in motion. The Falcon X program continued. New pilots rotated in for familiarization. I watched them the way my instructors once watched me, waiting for the moment when nerves would surface. When it did, I stepped in. Fly the numbers I told them, then let go. They listened. One afternoon, as I reviewed logs in the ready room, a junior aviator hovered near the doorway, shifting his weight. Ma'am, he said finally, that landing, how did you not freeze? I closed the file. I did, I said, just not where it showed. He frowned, then nodded slowly, understanding enough. As the sun dipped low over the Pacific, I walked the deck alone. The Antares hummed beneath my boots, constant and indifferent. I touched the compass under my collar. The needle pointed forward, steady. For the first time, I wasn't chasing approval. I wasn't outrunning a prediction. I was exactly where I was meant to be, earned, not granted. And somewhere behind me, a man who once believed I would crash and burn was learning how to watch without trying to control the descent. The morning after the gala, I woke before the alarm. The room was still the kind of quiet that settles only when a ship knows it's heading. I lay there for a moment, hands folded on my chest, feeling the slow return of ordinary breath. The wings rested on the desk where I'd left them, silver catching the first light. The compass lay beside them, needle steady. Legacy and direction. Not fused, not competing, aligned. Work resumed the way it always does, without waiting for feelings to catch up. Schedules posted, briefings started on time, coffee burned. I walked the hangar floor and nodded to faces that now nodded back without hesitation. Not awe, recognition. The difference mattered. I spent the morning with a new class cycling through Falcon X sims. One pilot flinched on final approach, a subtle hitch in the wrist that told me everything. I paused the feed and pointed to the data line. See that, I said. You're trying to fix tomorrow's problem today. Fly what's in front of you. He swallowed, nodded, reset. The next run was cleaner. When the sim ended, he looked relieved and a little embarrassed. Thank you, ma'am, he said. Don't thank me, I replied. Thank the work. At lunch, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. He's asking if you want to come by this weekend. No pressure. I stared at the words longer than I needed to. Then I typed back, I can stop in Sunday. She responded with a heart. Small symbols can carry a lot of weight. Sunday came with clear skies and a light wind. I drove up the familiar road, noticing details I'd once avoided, the way the trees leaned the flag by the porch that never touched the ground. He opened the door before I knocked. No uniform, no medals, just a sweater and a tired smile. "Coffee?" he asked. "Yes," I said. We sat at the kitchen table where arguments used to land harder than plates. He poured carefully, hand steady. For a while we talked about nothing that mattered: weather, traffic, the neighbor's new fence. Then he set his cup down and folded his hands. "I used to think strength meant never changing your mind," he said. I was wrong. I didn't rush to fill the space. Silence had taught me its value. "I watched you fly," he continued. "Not just that day. I've been watching for years. I just didn't know how to admit what it meant." "What did it mean?" I asked. "That you were better than my fear," he said. "And that frightened me." I nodded. Fear makes us say things we can't take back. "I know," he said quietly. "I said you'd crash and burn. I believed it would keep you close." "It didn't," I said, "but it taught me something." He looked up. "What?" "How to land anyway." We didn't hug. We didn't need to. He reached across the table and rested his hand near mine, close enough to be intentional. That was new. That was enough. When I left, the sky felt wide in a way it hadn't before. Not empty. Open. Back on the Antares. Later that week, I stood on the observation deck alone, watching the ocean work. The arrestor cables gleamed. The deck crew moved with the same quiet competence I'd come to trust. I breathed in salt and fuel and memory. There's a saying among carrier pilots that the sea only respects the landing. It doesn't care about your name, your pedigree, your predictions. It doesn't clap for intentions. It waits. And when you touch down clean, it lets you stay. I learned something else too. Families are like flight decks. They move. They shift. They test you in ways weather never will. You can wave off forever, or you can commit knowing the wire might bite and the steel won't bend for you. Either way, you have to fly the approach yourself. Weeks later, a young pilot found me on the deck as the sun fell. He hesitated, then spoke. "My dad says I'm chasing the wrong thing," he said, "that I should choose something safer." I watched the horizon for a moment. "What do you want?" I asked. "To fly," he said, "but I don't want to lose him." "You might not," I said, "and you might. Either way, don't lose yourself trying to keep the peace." He nodded, absorbing it. Then he squared his shoulders and walked back toward the ready room lighter than he'd arrived. That night I placed the wings back in the box and slid it into the drawer, not hidden, not displayed. The compass stayed where it always had, against my skin. The needle pointed forward, but it no longer felt like a chase. It felt like a choice. I don't know what comes next. Command, teaching, writing the manuals no one reads until they're in trouble. I know this. I was told I'd crash and burn. I was told I didn't belong. I was told silence meant weakness. They were wrong. I landed because I prepared. I stayed because I earned it. And I learned that pride doesn't have to be loud to be real, and love doesn't have to be perfect to be honest. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a landing you made without applause or a silence you carried longer than you should, I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, or share the moment that taught you how to stay steady when the deck moved beneath your feet. We tell these stories for the quiet ones, the ones who keep flying anyway. Subscribe if you'd like to continue the journey with us. We're here every day, and there's more ahead. My phone vibrated once in my hand as the church doors waited to open. Just one sharp buzz, quiet final. I glanced down, expecting a reminder or a well-wish. Instead, I read a sentence that split my chest open without making a sound. "I'm not coming. You're a disgrace to this family." It was from my father, on my wedding day. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there in my dress blues medals cold against my skin while the music swelled, and a lifetime of silence suddenly found its voice. The organist struck the first note just as I locked my phone. The sound rolled through the chapel like a tide, slow and deliberate, echoing off stone walls and stained glass. Outside the sanctuary, guests were rising to their feet, programs rustling shoes scuffing softly against polished floors. Inside the vestibule, everything felt suspended flowers arranged with impossible care, ivory ribbons tied just tight enough, the air faintly scented with lilies and old wood. I stood alone in that small, beautiful space, bouquet steady in my left hand, my right still warm from the phone. I was wearing my army dress blues. The jacket had been pressed to perfection, the seams sharp, the brass buttons catching fragments of colored light as the sun filtered through the glass. 4 ribbons sat above my heart, neat and unassuming. On my shoulders, the silver oak leaves marked my rank. Lieutenant Colonel. I had earned every inch of that uniform, every sleepless night, every mile logged, every order given when hesitation could have cost lives. I had chosen it deliberately weeks ago when everyone else was debating lace and trains and veils. This wasn't a statement for the room, it was a statement to myself. I read the message again in my head as if repetition might soften it. It didn't. The words landed the way bad news sometimes does not with fireworks, but with a dull thud, like the moment before a collision when your body knows something terrible is coming and has no time to react. I'd faced live fire without flinching. I'd coordinated evacuations under pressure that made grown men freeze. None of that felt like this. I shouldn't have been surprised. My father hadn't RSVP'd. He hadn't called. He hadn't even sent a card. Still, some foolish part of me had believed that today of all days he might show up, that seeing me standing tall marrying a man who respected who I was, and what I did might finally shift something in him. I'd imagined catching his eye from the aisle, imagined a nod, a concession, anything that said, "I see you now." Instead, I got a text. My fingers trembled just enough to notice. I exhaled slowly the way they teach you to when everything inside wants to surge forward at once. Control the breath. Control the moment. Don't let the noise in your head dictate your next move. "Hey," Mark said gently. I hadn't heard him approach. He was a few steps away, straightening his tie in front of the antique mirror, his reflection calm, focused. He looked exactly the way he always did when he was thinking 3 moves ahead, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, the faintest crease between his brows. He took one look at my face and crossed the distance without rushing. "What is it?" he asked. I didn't trust my voice, so I handed him the phone. He read the message once. His jaw tightened for a heartbeat, just long enough for me to see it, then eased. He gave the phone back, leaned down, and kissed my forehead with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything. "Give it 2 hours," he said. I blinked. 2 hours. He smiled, that knowing smile that had pulled me in the first time we met. Not smug, not dramatic, just assured. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his own phone, tapped the screen once, and stepped aside. I didn't hear what he said. He kept his voice low, even the way he did when he was solving a problem rather than reacting to it. The call was brief. When he ended it, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and took my hands in both of his. "Let's not give your father another inch of today," he said softly. "You deserve the whole thing." I swallowed, nodded, and squared my shoulders. The doors opened. The sanctuary fell quiet, not because of my uniform, not because anyone was surprised, but because of the way I walked. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I moved down the aisle with purpose, boots silent against the floor bouquet, steady spine straight. Faces blurred into a warm wash of color, friends, family, colleagues who had shown up when it mattered. I caught Mark's eye at the altar, and the look he gave me then was everything my father had never managed to offer: pride without conditions. The ceremony was simple, sacred. The words carried weight without excess, each vow spoken clearly, deliberately. I didn't cry, not until Mark reached for my hand, and his thumb brushed over the small callus near my trigger finger, like he understood the path that had led me here better than anyone else ever had. When we kissed, something in my chest finally unclenched. For the first time that day, I felt whole. It wasn't until the reception that my phone found its way back into my awareness. We were halfway through our first dance, the band playing something slow and familiar, when my maid of honor hurried over, eyes wide. "Rachel," she whispered, pressing the phone into my hand. "Your phone's been going crazy." I looked down. 38 missed calls. All from one number. Dad. Mark leaned in just enough for me to hear him over the music. 2 hours, he murmured. And in that moment, standing there under soft lights with his hand warm at my back and my father's name lighting up the screen, I realized something fundamental had shifted. Whatever silence had ruled my life until now, it was no longer mine to carry. I didn't answer the phone. Not during the dance. Not when the song ended and applause rippled politely through the room. Not when someone pressed a champagne flute into my hand and said something about how beautiful everything was. I slipped the phone into the small pocket sewn into my jacket, lining the one meant for documents, not emergencies, and let the music carry me forward. Mark noticed, of course, he always did. "You okay?" he asked quietly as we stepped aside, giving the band room to reset. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. He nodded like that answer made perfect sense. "Then we don't decide anything yet." That was Mark. He didn't rush emotions. He treated them the way he treated blueprints and timelines, things that needed space to reveal their shape. The reception unfolded in gentle layers. Laughter at the bar, a clink of silverware. My aunt dabbing her eyes during the toast. Someone telling a story about basic training that made half the table laugh and the other half wince. I smiled when it was appropriate. I listened. I stayed present. And every so often, like a distant tremor, I felt the vibration of my phone against my side. I ignored it every time. By the time we cut the cake, the number had climbed higher. I didn't look. I didn't need to. It wasn't until later, after the last song, after the hugs and handshakes and the soft chaos of goodbyes, that I finally excused myself. The bridal suite was quiet, tucked away from the noise. The lights dimmed low. I closed the door behind me and leaned back against it for a moment, letting the silence settle. I took the phone out. 38 missed calls. A handful of voicemails. All from him. I sat on the edge of the tufted bench bouquet resting beside me and pressed play on the first message. "Rachel, call me when you get this." His voice was clipped, controlled, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. The second message followed minutes later. "I may have overreacted. We should talk." The third came with a hitch in his breath. "Rachel, please, something's happened." By the fourth, the control was gone. Just call me." I stared at the screen, my reflection faint and warped in the glass. The uniform that had felt like armor all day suddenly felt heavy. The metals pressed into my chest when I leaned forward, a physical reminder of everything I had earned and everything my father had refused to see. There was a knock at the door, soft, respectful. Mark stepped in when I opened it. His jacket was off now, tie loosened, sleeves rolled just enough to show he'd shifted out of formal mode without losing his edge. He took one look at my face and sat beside me. "How many?" he asked. 38, I said. He let out a quiet breath. He's persistent. "What did you do?" I asked, not accusing, just needing to understand. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed me his phone. "Check your alerts." My hands shook just a little as I unlocked it. I opened the browser and typed my name, half expecting nothing, half expecting everything. The headline filled the screen. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Whitmore, the service behind the silence. It was front page. A full feature. My photo at the top, saluting beside my unit son, cutting sharp lines across the image. Below it, words I recognized from old citations and after-action reports, now woven into something larger. 16 years of service, deployments, commendations. The convoy operation in Kandahar where 14 personnel made it home because we rerouted under fire. The Bronze Star. The leadership training. The quiet nomination that had never been public before. I felt my throat close. "I thought they weren't publishing this until next month," I whispered. "They weren't," Mark said evenly. I made a call. I looked at him. Really looked. "You leaked it." "I expedited the truth," he corrected gently. "Your father wanted to define today as disgrace. I figured it was time the rest of the world saw who you actually are." I laughed, then a soft fractured sound that surprised me. "You turned my wedding into a media event." He shook his head. "No, I leveled the battlefield." I leaned into him, forehead resting against his shoulder, and for the first time all day, I let myself feel it. The exhaustion, the release, the strange mix of vindication and grief. This wasn't revenge. It didn't taste sharp or sweet. It felt inevitable. By morning, the story was everywhere. Other outlets picked it up. Veterans groups shared it. Former commanders commented. A retired general posted a short note that read, one of the finest officers I ever had the privilege to serve beside. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, some congratulatory, some apologetic, all tinged with the same realization they hadn't known. And now they did. My father called again around noon. This time I answered. "Rachel." His voice was strained, stripped of its usual authority. I saw the article." "I assumed you would," I said. There was a pause. What I said yesterday, what I texted, it was out of line. "You didn't understand," I said quietly. "No," he admitted. "I didn't want to." He asked if he could see me, just talk. I gave him the name of a cafe down the block, neutral ground. 30 minutes, I said. That's all I can promise. When I hung up, Mark was watching me carefully. "You sure?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I'm tired of carrying the silence." As I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, my phone buzzed again. Another missed call, then another. I didn't look at the number this time. I already knew. For the first time in my life, my father wasn't calling to pass judgment. He was calling because he had lost control of the narrative, and he didn't know how to stand without it. The cafe was already half full when I arrived. Late morning light poured through the front windows, catching dust in the air and turning it gold. The place smelled like roasted beans and warm pastries, the kind of ordinary comfort that made conversations feel safer than they were. I chose a table near the window, ordered tea, and sat with my hands wrapped around the cup watching people pass outside. Couples, parents with strollers. A man in a suit talking too loudly on his phone. Life moving forward uninterrupted. My father walked in exactly 7 minutes later. I recognized him instantly, of course. The posture was the same, back straight, shoulders squared, steps measured. He wore a charcoal gray suit pressed to perfection, and a pale blue shirt without a tie, as if he'd tried to soften himself at the last minute, and didn't quite know how. What stopped me wasn't his appearance, though. It was his face. For the first time I could remember, he hesitated. He scanned the room like someone entering unfamiliar territory, eyes flicking from table to table until they landed on me. When our gazes met, something in him faltered, just slightly. Enough that I noticed, enough that it mattered. "Rachel," he said when he reached the table. "Dad." He sat, cleared his throat, and folded his hands together, fingers interlaced. A courtroom habit. He'd spent 40 years doing that, arranging himself into a position of authority before speaking. Today it looked more like armor than command. "I'll be direct," he began. "What I said yesterday was wrong." I lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Before you go any further, I need you to listen." He blinked, clearly not used to being interrupted, then nodded once. "All right." "What you sent me wasn't just about a wedding," I said. My voice was steady even. I'd had a lifetime of practice delivering hard truths without raising my volume. It was about everything you've never said. Every time you chose silence. Every time you decided who I was without asking. His jaw tightened. He didn't argue. "You didn't just miss a ceremony," I continued. "You missed a lifetime of becoming." That landed. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the way his eyes dropped to his hands. For a moment he looked older than I remembered. Smaller. Not weak, just human. "I thought I was protecting you," he said finally. "The military, it's harsh. I've seen what it does to people. I didn't want that life for you." "It didn't break me," I said. "It built me." He looked up, then really looked. "I see that now." "No," I said softly. "You see it because everyone else does. Because it's in print. Because it has headlines." Silence stretched between us, thick but not hostile. The waitress passed by, refilling water glasses, blissfully unaware that decades of tension were unfolding 2 feet from her elbow. "When your mother died," my father said slowly, "I lost my balance. I doubled down on structure. On expectations. I thought if I could keep everything ordered, nothing else would fall apart. I remembered my mother clearly. Her quiet presence. The way she listened more than she spoke, the way she smoothed rough edges without announcing it. When she was gone, the house had felt sharper, louder, like all the soft things had been removed. "You wanted me to go to Yale," I said. He nodded. It was a good path. "I enlisted instead." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I know." "You didn't speak to me for 2 years." Another nod, smaller this time. Basic training was the first place I ever felt free, I said. There were rules, yes. But they were clear. They weren't used to control me. They were used to keep people alive. I told him about the early mornings, the exhaustion, the strange comfort of knowing exactly what was expected of me. I told him about learning to lead, about discovering that I could stay calm when everything around me was chaos, about the pride I'd felt the first time someone trusted me with their safety. He listened, actually listened. No interruptions, no rebuttals. I sent you photos, I said. Graduations, promotions, awards. You never responded. I didn't know how he said hoarsely. That's not the same as trying. He exhaled long and slow. I thought if I ignored it, you'd come back, that eventually you'd realize it was a mistake. And when I didn't. Then I told myself it was rebellion, or stubbornness, anything but success. I let that sit between us. Do you know what hurt the most, I asked? Not that you disagreed with my choices, it was that you never showed up, not once, not even to see who I'd become. His hands clenched on the table. I was wrong. The words were quiet, unadorned, not a performance. I'm not asking for forgiveness today, I said. I'm setting boundaries. He looked at me, eyes searching. What does that mean? If you want a place in my life now, it's on my terms, I said. Respect first, apology second, and you don't get to skip either. He nodded. Slowly, I understand. After a moment, he asked, There's a brunch tomorrow, after the reception. Could I come? I'd sit in the back. I wouldn't make a scene. I studied him, the man who had once commanded rooms with a glance, who had decided my future before I was old enough to vote, now asking, not assuming. Yes, I said at last, you can come. Relief flickered across his face, not triumph, not entitlement, just relief. When we stood to leave, there was no hug, no dramatic reconciliation, just a brief nod from each of us, an acknowledgement that something had shifted even if it wasn't settled. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the sun felt warmer than before. I wasn't carrying his judgment anymore. And for the first time, I realized how heavy it had been. I didn't tell Mark everything that was said at the cafe. Not right away. Some conversations need air before they can be translated. They need to settle to lose their sharpest edges. We walked back to the hotel side by side, the city humming around us, and he didn't press. He never did. He waited until I was ready, and when I finally spoke, it came out in fragments, what my father admitted, what he didn't, the way his voice had sounded when he asked to sit in the back. Mark listened without interrupting his expression, thoughtful, unreadable, in the way that meant he was already mapping consequences. I didn't plan for all of this to spiral, he said when I finished, but I knew one thing for sure. What's that? He was counting on silence, Mark said. People like your father always do. We sat on the edge of the bed, shoes kicked off the room, still scattered with evidence of the day garment bags, flowers in water-filled vases, cards stacked neatly on the dresser. Outside, traffic moved in steady waves, headlights blinking on as dusk crept in. He spent his entire life controlling narratives, Mark continued. Courtrooms, opinions, reputations. He didn't expect the truth to move faster than he could. I thought of the calls, the voicemails, the sudden shift from judgment to urgency. So you just called the press? Mark smiled faintly. Not exactly. He explained it the way he explained everything, methodically, without drama. He hadn't cold-called a newsroom. He'd reached out to Jim McAllister, an old college friend who now edited a national paper's service and leadership column. They'd talked years ago about doing a profile on military leadership in non-traditional spaces, logistics, coordination, decision-making under pressure. My name had come up then, quietly, respectfully. I knew they had the file, Mark said, the interviews, the citations. They were waiting for a green light. And you gave it to them, I said. I told them it was time, he replied, that the story mattered now. I leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. You realize he's going to think you did this to punish him? Mark shrugged. He can think whatever he wants. This wasn't about him. That was the thing about Mark. He never centered himself as the hero. He didn't even center himself as the avenger. He centered the truth. Everything else was collateral. By the next morning, the ripple had become a wave. The article wasn't just shared, it was discussed, commented on, quoted. Other outlets followed up, adding context, pulling in voices from units I'd served with commanders who spoke plainly about competence and trust. A retired colonel wrote a short piece titled "Leadership You Don't See Coming." A veterans organization reposted it with a caption that read, "This is what service looks like." My phone became unusable, messages stacked on messages. Some were congratulations, others were apologies from relatives who'd once nodded along with my father's assessments, from acquaintances who'd made jokes about playing soldier. A few came from young women in uniform thanking me for showing them what was possible. Through it all, my father stayed quiet. No calls, no messages. That silence felt different from the ones before. This wasn't dismissal. This was recalibration. At brunch the next day, he arrived alone. The room was warm and informal, long tables, coffee cups, pastries disappearing faster than anyone could track. Mark and I moved easily through it, laughing, listening, accepting congratulations. I saw my father near the back, exactly where he'd said he'd sit. He didn't approach, he didn't try to reclaim space. He watched. People noticed him, of course. In our hometown, the Whitmore name carried weight. Whispers followed him like a shadow. I didn't watch his reaction. I didn't need to. This wasn't my reckoning to manage. Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned, Mark leaned in and said quietly, "You don't have to do anything." "I know," I said, and I meant it. The real consequence came days later. A local paper ran a small piece, buried but unmistakable. Retired judge's absence raises questions after daughter's wedding. It didn't accuse. It didn't sensationalize. It simply laid out facts that had never been placed side by side before. Service record, public snub, silence. That was enough. My father had spent decades believing that control was strength. Now he was learning the cost of mistaking it for respect. He didn't call again that week. Instead, I received a letter. It was handwritten, the paper thick, the ink precise. He didn't apologize outright. Not yet. He acknowledged harm. He acknowledged blindness. He wrote about pride the way a lawyer might, carefully, as if naming it too directly might give it more power than it deserved. At the end, he wrote one sentence that stopped me cold. "I am beginning to understand that silence can be its own kind of cruelty." I folded the letter and set it aside. That night, Mark and I sat on the balcony, city lights flickering below. "Do you regret it?" I asked him. "Making the call." He shook his head, no. "Even knowing it might cost him?" Mark looked at me, then really looked. "It didn't cost him anything he wasn't already spending," he said. "It just stopped him from spending it on you." I thought about that long after he went inside. Because for the first time, the power dynamic had shifted without shouting, without confrontation, without spectacle. The truth had simply stepped into the light and refused to move. And my father, for all his training in argument and authority, was left with nothing to say. The cafe meeting hadn't ended anything. If anything, it had opened a door neither of us knew how to walk through yet. The week after the wedding moved quickly, as weeks often do when life decides not to wait for emotional closure. Thank you notes piled up on the kitchen table. Flowers wilted one by one. Mark returned to work with the same steady focus he brought to everything, while I reported back to base to finish out a transition period I'd postponed for the wedding. On the surface, things looked normal. Underneath, something was shifting. I heard it first through other people. A cousin called to check in, her voice carefully neutral, as if she didn't want to say too much and risk choosing the wrong side. An old family friend sent a message that began with, "I hope you know how proud we all are," followed by a pause long enough to feel deliberate. Even my aunt, my father's sister, usually the quietest of the lot, left a voicemail that ended with, "He's having a hard time." Not that it excuses anything. I didn't respond to any of it. Not because I was angry, but because I finally understood something I'd missed for years. Explaining myself had never changed the outcome. It had only delayed my own peace. My father didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't send another letter. And that silence, this one, wasn't punishment. It was reckoning. 2 weeks after the wedding, I was invited to speak at a small veterans leadership forum. Nothing flashy. A panel discussion in a municipal building with folding chairs and bad coffee, the kind of event that mattered because of who was in the room, not who wrote about it afterward. I almost declined. Public attention still felt strange, like wearing someone else's jacket. Mark encouraged me to go. You don't owe them anything, he said, but you owe yourself the chance to say what you believe. So I went. I talked about service without romance, about decisions made in narrow windows, about leadership as responsibility, not authority. I spoke plainly the way I always had, and when it was over, the applause wasn't loud, but it was sincere. As I stepped off the small stage, I saw him. My father stood near the back, hands folded in front of him, posture familiar and foreign all at once. He hadn't been on the program, he hadn't told me he was coming, he hadn't tried to sit up front. He waited until the room thinned before approaching. "Rachel," he said. I nodded. "Dad." He looked older than he had at the cafe. Not weaker, just worn in a way that suggested he'd been thinking too much and sleeping too little. "You spoke well," he said. "You always did." I let that pass. Compliments without accountability had lost their currency. "I didn't come to interrupt," he added. "I just wanted to listen." "That's new," I said gently. He didn't argue. "It is." We stood there for a moment, the hum of cleanup around us, chairs stacking, voices fading. Finally he said, "I've been asked to step down from one of my board appointments." I raised an eyebrow. "Asked?" He gave a thin smile, strongly encouraged. There it was. The consequence he hadn't anticipated. Not public shaming, not disgrace in the dramatic sense, just the slow erosion of unquestioned authority. "How do you feel about that?" I asked. He considered the question carefully. "Embarrassed," he said, humbled, and if I'm honest, relieved. That surprised me. "I spent so long defending a version of myself that I forgot to examine it," he continued. "Now that I'm forced to, I see how narrow it was." I waited. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, echoing my words from the cafe. "I'm trying to understand what comes next." I met his gaze. "That depends on whether you're willing to listen when the answers aren't comfortable." He nodded. "I am." That was the closest we came to reconciliation that day. Over the next month, small things changed. He withdrew from another committee, quietly, no announcements. He began volunteering at a local VA legal clinic, offering guidance on benefits appeals and paperwork work that required patience rather than judgment. I heard about it through someone else, not from him. That felt intentional, appropriate. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a single-page letter. He wrote about the first case he'd helped a young man recently discharged, overwhelmed by forms and deadlines, convinced the system was designed to fail him. My father described listening more than speaking, resisting the urge to correct, to direct, to dominate the conversation. He admitted it had been harder than any courtroom cross-examination. At the end, he wrote, "I am learning that respect isn't reclaimed by argument. It's earned by attention." I sat with that letter for a long time. Not because it fixed anything, but because it showed movement. Mark noticed the change before I said anything. "You're lighter," he said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "I think I finally put something down," I replied. He smiled. "Good." The real test came at a small ceremony weeks later, when I was recognized by my unit for a transition assignment. I'd accepted a civilian-military liaison role focused on reintegration. It wasn't national news. It wasn't glamorous. But it mattered. As I stood at the podium looking out at familiar faces, I saw my father again, this time not at the back but off to the side, clearly uncertain where he belonged. He didn't approach afterward. He didn't speak. He simply watched, hands clasped, eyes steady. And for the first time I didn't feel the need to look back. Because the power had shifted not through confrontation but through consequence. Not through revenge but through release. The ceremony ended without fanfare. No speeches afterward, no press. Just a few handshakes, quiet congratulations, and the familiar ritual of folding chairs and stacking programs. It was the kind of ending that suited me, contained, purposeful, complete. I changed out of my uniform in the locker room, running my fingers once over the ribbons before placing the jacket carefully in its garment bag. For years, wearing it had felt like a shield. Lately, it felt more like a mirror. Outside, the late afternoon air was crisp. Mark waited by the car, hands in his pockets, watching people drift past with the easy patience of someone who never felt the need to rush a moment. When he saw my expression, he smiled. "Ready?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, and for once it wasn't a complicated answer. Over the next few weeks, the aftershocks settled into something quieter, more deliberate. My father didn't reinsert himself into my life. He didn't call to offer advice. He didn't show up unannounced or test the boundaries I'd laid down. Instead, I heard about him through fragments, small updates passed along by others, the way news travels when it's no longer controlled by the person at its center. He'd officially stepped down from his remaining board positions. Not in protest, not with a statement. Just a letter of resignation effective immediately. People speculated, of course. They always do. But he didn't respond to any of it. He spent more time at the VA clinic. At first, he worked quietly reviewing cases, helping veterans navigate appeals and benefits with the same meticulous attention he'd once reserved for constitutional arguments. Then slowly he began mentoring, teaching younger advocates how to prepare hearings, how to listen without interrupting, how to recognize when the law needed interpretation rather than enforcement. I learned all of this secondhand. And that mattered. Because for the first time, his actions weren't a performance for me. They weren't requests for absolution or attempts to rewrite the past. They were choices made without expectation of reward. One evening, a former colleague of his stopped me after a community event. "Your father talks about you differently now," she said carefully. Not as a point of pride, more like a lesson. I thanked her and let the conversation end there. At home, Mark and I settled into a rhythm that felt newly unburdened. Morning coffee on the balcony. Evenings spent cooking simple meals and talking about everything except what had already been said too many times. When the phone rang, my shoulders no longer tensed by reflex. The strangest part was the absence of triumph. I had imagined once that if my father ever lost the authority he'd wielded so effortlessly, it might feel like vindication. That seeing him humbled would restore some balance. Instead, what I felt was something closer to neutrality. Like watching a storm pass and realizing the ground beneath your feet was still solid. That was the price of pride. Not humiliation, not disgrace. Isolation. He had built his identity on certainty, on the belief that he knew best. When that certainty cracked, it didn't shatter him publicly. It simply left him standing alone with questions he'd never practiced answering. One afternoon, a package arrived at the house. Inside was a book. Not a legal text. Not a memoir, a slim volume on restorative justice, dog-eared, annotated, clearly used. Inside the cover, he'd written a single line. "For when listening matters more than winning." There was no signature. I didn't call him after that. Not because I was withholding anything, but because I understood finally that repair didn't require constant contact. It required consistency, time, space for new patterns to form without being forced. Months passed. My work in the liaison role expanded, pulling me into conversations about policy gaps, reintegration failures, and the quiet ways people fell through systems designed without enough listening. I found myself drawing on skills I hadn't even known I'd developed, bridging perspectives, translating urgency into process, advocating without antagonizing. In many ways, I was doing what my father had always claimed to value. Just differently. At a small holiday gathering hosted by friends, someone asked casually, "So how's your dad doing?" I paused, considering the question. "He's learning," I said at last. And that felt accurate. The real moment of clarity came unexpectedly. I was cleaning out old files one evening when I found a box of letters I'd written over the years, unsent drafts, postcards, never mailed notes composed in moments of hope or anger and set aside. I sat on the floor reading through them, tracing the arc of a daughter trying over and over to be understood. I didn't feel the need to send any of them anymore. I sealed the box and put it back on the shelf. That was when I knew the balance had been restored, not because my father had changed enough, but because I no longer needed him to. The cost of his pride had been distance. The reward of mine was peace. And peace, I was learning, was not passive. It was chosen, maintained, protected. Not with silence, but with clarity. The invitation arrived on thick cream paper, the kind reserved for moments meant to feel permanent. I recognized the seal before I read the words. It was a small national ceremony, formal, contained, deliberately understated. Not a spectacle. Not a headline grabber. A recognition of service tied to transition work I'd been doing quietly for months, bridging gaps between active duty and civilian systems. The kind of work no one noticed until it failed. Mark read the letter over my shoulder. "You should go," he said simply. "I know," I replied. What I didn't say, what I didn't need to, was that part of me wondered whether my father would be there. Not because I needed him to be, but because his absence, once so loud, had become something I could finally hear clearly. The ceremony took place in a long, narrow hall with tall windows and polished stone floors. Flags lined the walls. The crowd was modest colleagues, a few officials, family members scattered among them. I wore my uniform again, not because it was required, but because it felt honest. When my name was called, I stood with purpose, not pride, purpose. The applause was steady, respectful. As I stepped forward, I felt the weight of the moment, not as validation, but as acknowledgement, of nights spent untangling systems, of conversations held in small rooms where nothing was glamorous and everything mattered. As I returned to my seat, I saw him. My father sat in the back row, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. He didn't raise a phone. He didn't look around to see who noticed him. He didn't smile when our eyes met. He simply nodded. After the ceremony, I lingered near a marble column waiting for Mark, who had been pulled into a conversation. That's when I sensed someone standing just outside my line of sight. "Rachel," my father said quietly. I turned. He looked older than I remembered. Not diminished, just worn in the way people are when they finally stop pretending they have all the answers. His suit was neat, but unremarkable. His voice steady, but careful. "I didn't come to make a scene," he continued. "I just wanted to witness it. To see you honored the way you always should have been." I studied him not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a woman deciding what she was willing to carry forward. "You didn't just miss the wedding," I said calmly. "You missed everything that led to it. The woman I became in the absence of your blessing." His eyes filled, though he didn't let the tears fall. "I know." We stood there, the sounds of conversation echoing faintly around us. Finally, he spoke again. "I was wrong. About the military, about you, about what strength looks like." I let the silence stretch. "I'm not here to absolve you," I said, "and I'm not reopening old wounds." He nodded. "I understand. And if there's going to be a place for you in my life," I added, "it will be on my terms. Respect isn't optional, apologies aren't symbolic, and presence matters more than intention." His shoulders dropped just slightly. "I'm sorry," he said. This time without qualifiers, without defenses. I exhaled. It didn't fix everything, it didn't erase the past, but it mattered. "Not tonight," I said gently, gesturing toward the hall behind me. "Tonight is mine, but there might be a tomorrow." He accepted that without protest. Mark joined me a moment later, slipping his hand into mine, as if it had always belonged there. My father nodded to him once, a quiet acknowledgement of the man who had changed the equation without ever raising his voice. We walked away together. In the months that followed, life continued messy, meaningful, unspectacular. I built programs. I listened to stories. I learned how much damage silence could do when it went unchecked. My father kept volunteering. We spoke occasionally, carefully, honestly, without urgency. There was no dramatic reconciliation. Just alignment. One spring morning, as Mark and I packed for a speaking engagement, my phone buzzed. A message from my father. I completed my first mentorship cycle at the VA, teaching young veterans how to advocate for themselves. It's humbling work. Thank you for showing me what service can look like. I stared at the screen for a long time before showing it to Mark. "That's a different man," he said. "Yes," I replied, "and so am I." That evening, standing on another stage, looking out at a room full of faces, some hopeful, some weary, I told them the truth. I'd learned the hard way. Revenge is easy. It burns fast and leaves nothing behind. But real release takes patience. It takes boundaries. And sometimes it takes walking away from the need to be understood by the very people who should have known better. If someone once told you that you were a disgrace, if they refused to show up when it mattered, if their silence made you question your worth, hear this: you are not the sum of their judgment. You are the choices you make after it. And if this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear yours. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. We have many more stories like this to explore, stories about resilience, boundaries, and the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and let's continue this journey together.